Caleb Rourke stood on the station platform, a letter crumpled in his fist and a revolver cold against his hip, watching the eastbound train roll in with the weight of a mistake he couldn't undo. 3 years ago, grief had carved him hollow. 2 months ago, whiskey and loneliness had made him write to a matrimonial agency. Yesterday, their reply arrived. Your bride comes tomorrow. He'd planned to send her back with money and an apology until Clara Whitmore stepped off that train, looked him dead in the eye, and he realized she hadn't come to be saved. She'd come to survive. And that changed everything. If you're curious how a mail-order bride deal turned into something nobody expected, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this frontier story travels. The Wyoming wind cut across the platform like a dull blade, carrying dust and the smell of coal smoke from the departing train. Caleb Rourke stood with his hat pulled low, shoulders squared against more than just the weather. In his coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, was the letter that had arrived yesterday from the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Society. Your intended bride, Miss Clara Whitmore of Philadelphia, will arrive on the 2:15 train June 14th. He shouldn't have been surprised. He'd written them, after all. Late one February night, when the silence in his house had grown teeth, when the bottle was empty and the memories were too loud, he'd sat at his kitchen table and filled out their questionnaire. Rancher, widower, property owner, seeking companionship. He'd mailed it before dawn broke, before sense could stop him. That was 4 months ago. He'd almost forgotten about it, almost convinced himself it had been a fever dream born of loneliness and bad whiskey. Until yesterday's letter proved otherwise. Now Caleb watched the train hiss and shudder to a stop, belching steam across the platform, and felt his jaw tighten with each second that passed. He had cash in his pocket, enough to pay for her return ticket, enough to compensate her for the trouble, enough to close this chapter before it opened. He'd rehearsed the words a dozen times on the ride into town. I apologize, ma'am. I made a mistake. This arrangement won't work. Here's money for your journey back. Clean, simple, final. The passenger car door swung open. A porter stepped down first, then turned to offer his hand. And Clara Whitmore descended. She wasn't what Caleb had imagined, not soft or wide-eyed or desperate. She wore a traveling dress the color of charcoal, practical and dust-marked from the journey, with her dark blonde hair pulled back in a way that showed her face completely. High cheekbones, pale skin touched by freckles, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray-blue. She carried one carpet bag herself and waited while the porter retrieved a small trunk from the luggage car. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, younger than he'd expected, though the agency had mentioned her age in their correspondence. But it wasn't her youth that caught him off guard. It was the way she stood, spine straight, chin level, surveying the platform and the town beyond with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory. Not afraid, not uncertain, just present. Caleb forced his boots to move, crossing the platform with the folded bills already in his hand. He'd kept his approach to the factual in his mind. Greet her, explain the situation, offer the money, arrange her departure. No room for guilt, no space for what-ifs. He stopped 3 feet from her, pulled off his hat in a gesture that was pure reflex. Miss Whitmore. Those gray-blue eyes turned to him, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction exactly, but recognition, like seeing someone who'd walked through the same kind of fire and come out the other side still standing. Mr. Rourke. Her voice was clear, educated, with an Eastern accent that sounded out of place against the raw frontier backdrop. She didn't smile, didn't curtsy or lower her eyes or do any of the things he vaguely expected. She just met his gaze head-on and waited. He cleared his throat. The speech he'd practiced suddenly felt hollow. I need to be honest with you, ma'am. I made a mistake. Did you? It wasn't quite a question. Writing to the agency, I wasn't in my right mind when I did it. I shouldn't have put you through the trouble of traveling all this way. He held out the money, feeling the weight of it. This should cover your return ticket and then some. I'll make sure you're comfortable at the hotel tonight and you can head back east on tomorrow's train. I apologize for the inconvenience. Clara looked at the money in his hand, then she looked at him. Then, to his complete bewilderment, she smiled, but it wasn't warmth in that expression. It was something harder, something that had edges. "No," she said. Caleb blinked. "Ma'am." "No, Mr. Rourke. I won't be taking your money, and I won't be leaving on tomorrow's train." The wind gusted between them, catching the hem of her skirt. Somewhere down the platform, a man shouted instructions to a freight handler. The normal sounds of the station continued around them, but Caleb felt like he'd stepped into a different conversation entirely, one where the rules had changed and he hadn't been informed. "I don't think you understand," he said carefully. "I'm offering you a way out of this arrangement. No hard feelings, no obligations." "I understand perfectly." Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through his protests. "You wrote to an agency in a moment of weakness. You regret it now. You want to erase your mistake with cash and good intentions. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Rourke. I didn't come here for you." That landed like a physical blow. Caleb's hand lowered slightly, the bill still clutched between his fingers. "Then why? I came here for a new life." Clara adjusted her grip on the carpet bag, and for the first time he noticed the worn quality of the fabric, the careful mending along one seam. "Philadelphia has nothing left for me. No family, no prospects, and no future that doesn't involve becoming someone's unpaid servant or worse. When your letter came through the agency, I saw an opportunity. Not romance, Mr. Rourke. Not rescue. Just a chance at something different." Caleb stared at her, trying to reconcile this blunt honesty with every assumption he'd carried onto this platform. "You're saying you want to marry a stranger for opportunity. I'm saying I want a life that's mine." Claire's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been desperation if it wasn't so tightly controlled. "Out here, I could build that. Back east, I can't. So no, I won't take your guilt money and climb back on that train." Before Caleb could formulate a response, a new voice cut through the moment. "Well, well, fresh off the train and already causing a stir." Caleb turned, instinctively shifting his body to put himself between Clara and the man approaching from the station house. Vernon Pike, town drunk, part-time ranch hand, full-time troublemaker. He wove slightly as he walked, whiskey loose and grinning in a way that made Caleb's jaw tighten. "That your new mail order woman, Rourke?" Pike's gaze slid past Caleb to Clara, and the grin widened. "Heard you sent away for one. Didn't believe it. Figured you were too dead inside to bother." "Walk away, Pike." Caleb's voice dropped to a register that had ended more than one confrontation before it started. But Pike was drunk enough to be stupid. He took another step closer, squinting at Clara with the exaggerated focus of someone whose vision had gone soft around the edges. "She's a pretty thing, I'll give you that. Though if Rourke here doesn't want you, sweetheart, I could show you a real good time. Better than some widow man rancher who hasn't smiled in 3 years." Clara's face remained perfectly neutral, but Caleb saw her hand tighten on the carpetbag handle. Before he could move, before he could put himself fully between them, she spoke. "I'd rather walk into a prairie fire," Clara said calmly, "than spend 5 minutes in your company. Now step back before you fall down, because you reek of whiskey and bad decisions, and I've had enough of both to last a lifetime." Pike's grin died. His face flushed, anger replacing amusement. "You mouthy little—" He reached for Clara's arm. Caleb moved. His hand caught Pike's wrist mid-grab, twisting it back and down with enough force to make the other man yelp. In the same motion, Caleb stepped in close, using his body weight to force Pike back 3 steps until the drunk's shoulders hit the station wall with a hollow thud. "You don't touch her," Caleb said quietly, his face inches from Pike's. "You don't speak to her. You don't look at her. You understand me?" Pike's bravado crumbled fast when faced with someone sober and twice as strong. He nodded, breathing hard, whiskey stink rolling off him in waves. Caleb held him there a moment longer, then released his wrist with enough force that Pike stumbled sideways. "Get out of here." Pike scrambled away, muttering curses under his breath, but not stupid enough to make them loud. He disappeared around the corner of the freight office, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation slowly dispersed, returning to their own business with the casual acceptance of people who'd seen worse on any given Saturday. Caleb turned back to Clara, half expecting to find her shaken or frightened. Instead, she'd set down her carpetbag and was watching him with that same steady assessment. "Thank you," she said. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that." Caleb felt anger still simmering under his skin, not at Clara, but at Pike, at this whole impossible situation. This place can be rough. Men like him think they can say or do whatever they want to a woman alone. Then it's fortunate I'm not alone. Clara picked up her bag again, and when she looked at him this time, something had shifted. Mr. Rourke, I'm going to make you a different proposition than the one you plan to refuse. Caleb waited, still trying to catch up with how fast this day had spun away from his control. Hire me as your housekeeper, Clara said. Pay me a fair wage. I'll cook, clean, manage your household. No marriage. No obligations beyond the work. Just employment and a roof over my head. If after a few months we both decide this isn't working, I'll have earned enough to make my own way, buy a train ticket somewhere else, find other work. But I won't go back east, and I won't take your charity. It was absurd, completely absurd. A single woman living at his ranch, working as his housekeeper, with no chaperone and no formal arrangement beyond employment? The town would talk. Hell, the whole county would talk. But as Caleb looked at Clara Whitmore, at the steel in her spine and the careful hope she was trying to hide, he thought about his ranch, about the cold house waiting there, rooms he hadn't entered in 3 years because they still smelled like grief, about the meals he'd stopped tasting, the dust he'd stopped seeing, the life he'd been living like a ghost. And he thought about Pike's reaching hand, about the way this frontier treated women who had no protection, no place, no power. The ranch is 8 miles out, he heard himself say. Nothing but grassland and sky. Nearest neighbor is the Taylor place, 4 miles south. It's isolated. I'm not afraid of isolation. Winter gets hard. Snow comes early, stays late. We can go weeks without seeing another soul. I survived 3 Philadelphia winters in a boarding house with no heat. I think I'll manage. Caleb studied her face, looking for cracks in that composed exterior. He found none, just determination and something else, something that looked like the same desperation he'd felt that February night when he'd written to the agency. Different circumstances, same core truth. Sometimes you reach for anything that might pull you out of the dark. $20 a month, he said, plus room and board. You keep the main house. I'll stay in the foreman's cabin. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. You'd move out of your own house? Seems appropriate given the arrangement. Caleb picked up her trunk, testing the weight. Not much. Everything she owned, probably, packed into one container. People will talk either way. Might as well give them less ammunition. For the first time, something that might have been genuine warmth crossed Clara's face. Not quite a smile, but close. That's considerate. Don't mistake consideration for approval, Miss Whitmore. This is a temporary arrangement, a trial period. Understood. Clara fell into step beside him as they crossed the platform toward where his wagon waited. How temporary are we talking? 3 months. End of summer. That gives us both time to figure out if this works. Fair enough. They reached the wagon, a sturdy flatbed that had seen better years but still ran solid. Caleb loaded the trunk into the back, then offered his hand to help Clara up to the bench seat. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before taking it, her palm cool and calloused against his. Working hands, he noted. Not soft, not unused to labor. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching over the rutted street that led out of town. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The silence filled with the creak of leather and wood, the steady clip of hooves, the endless whisper of wind across the open grassland. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. You lost someone. It wasn't a question. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't look at her. What makes you say that? The way you talk about the house, like it's a place you're avoiding, and Pike mentioned you hadn't smiled in 3 years. She paused. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have... My wife and son. The words came out flat, factual, easier that way. Fever took them both, 3 years ago this October. Clara was quiet for a long moment, then, my mother died when I was 12, cholera. My father followed 6 months later, couldn't live with the grief. I understand what it means to survive people you love. Caleb glanced at her, surprised by the offering. Most people, when they learned about Margaret and Samuel, responded with pity or awkward platitudes. Clara just stated her own losses like coordinates on a map. Here's where I've been. Here's what I've walked through. Is that why you left Philadelphia? He asked. Partly. Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the mountains rose in distant purple silhouette. I was living with my father's sister. She had plans for me. A marriage to a man twice my age who saw me as an investment. When I refused, she made it clear I was no longer welcome in her home. So you chose the frontier over a society marriage. I chose freedom over a gilded cage. Clara finally looked at him, and in the afternoon light, her eyes were more gray than blue. Even if freedom means starting over with nothing. Caleb considered that. Considered this woman who'd crossed half a continent on the strength of a stranger's letter, who'd faced down a drunk without flinching, who spoke about loss like someone who'd learned to carry it without letting it break her spine. You know anything about running a ranch household? He asked. I can cook, clean, mend, and manage accounts. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly. It's not just about work. It's about understanding this place, the rhythm of it. Out here, winter prep starts in August. Supply runs happen monthly if the weather holds. Everything depends on water, grass, and whether the cattle stay healthy. He glanced at her. It's not Philadelphia. Thank God for that. The corner of Caleb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. The first time in, he couldn't remember how long. They rode in silence for another mile before the ranch came into view. His land spread out in all directions, grassland rolling away to meet the sky, broken up by fence lines and scattered cottonwoods marking where water ran. The house sat on a slight rise, 2 stories of weathered wood with a broad porch and a chimney that needed repointing. The barn stood off to the east, larger than the house, with a corral system that held his current string of horses. Beyond that, the cattle dotted the landscape in dark clusters. Caleb watched Clara take it all in, trying to see it through her eyes. The isolation, the emptiness, the raw, unforgiving beauty of a place that gave nothing easily. It's bigger than I expected, Clara said quietly. 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, enough horses to work them. Caleb pointed toward a smaller building near the barn. That's the foreman's cabin, where I'll be staying. Jack Torres runs the day-to-day operations. You'll meet him tomorrow. Good man. Keeps to himself mostly. He pulled the wagon up to the main house, set the brake, and climbed down. The porch creaked under his boots, a sound so familiar it had become invisible. How long since he'd really looked at this place? The peeling paint around the windows, the sagging step that needed replacing, the general air of neglect that came from treating a home like just a place to sleep. Clara descended from the wagon without waiting for his help, moving with the same self-sufficient grace she'd shown at the station. She stood looking up at the house, and Caleb wondered what she saw. A fresh start? A mistake? A prison with a different set of bars? Come on, he said, climbing the porch steps. I'll show you inside. The front door stuck slightly. It always did when the humidity was high, and Caleb had to put his shoulder into it. It swung open with a groan, revealing the front hallway with its dust-covered table and the stairs leading up to the second floor. He stepped aside to let Clara enter first. She walked in slowly, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Caleb followed, seeing the place with fresh eyes and not liking what he saw. Dust everywhere, dishes piled in the kitchen sink, visible through the open doorway. The fireplace in the main room cold and full of old ashes. The furniture covered in the fine grit that came in through windows he never quite got closed properly. It looked like what it was, a place where someone existed but didn't live. Clara set her carpet bag down carefully, turned in a slow circle. When did you last have a proper meal in here? Caleb had to think about it. Can't remember. I mostly eat in the bunkhouse with Jack. And when did you last open these windows? Spring, maybe. Clara walked to the nearest window, fought with the swollen frame for a moment, then managed to shove it open. Fresh air poured in, carrying the smell of grass and distance. She moved to the next window, then the next, opening them systematically, while Caleb stood in the hallway, feeling oddly like an intruder in his own home. You have linens? Clara asked, already heading for the stairs. Second door on the left. Should be sheets in the chest. She disappeared upstairs and Caleb heard her moving around, opening doors, assessing. He walked into the kitchen, really looked at it for the first time in months. The cast iron stove needed blacking. The floor needed scrubbing. The whole room needed someone who gave a damn about whether it was clean or not. When Clara came back downstairs, she'd rolled up her sleeves and pulled her hair back tighter. I'll need supplies, cleaning supplies, food staples. Do you have a list of what's usually stocked? I can write one up. Good. I'll start with the kitchen tonight, tackle the rest tomorrow. She looked at him directly, all business now. I'll need access to the household funds, or do you prefer to handle all purchases yourself? Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been operating on instinct since the moment she'd refused to leave. I'll set up an account at the general store. You can buy what you need, within reason. Define within reason. Don't buy anything I can't eat, wear, or use to fix something broken. Clara's mouth quirked. That's a low bar, Mr. Rourke. It's an honest one. They stood looking at each other across the dusty kitchen, and Caleb felt the strangeness of the moment settle over him. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether to sell the spring calves early or wait for better prices. Now, he had a woman in his house, a sharp-tongued, steel-spined woman who'd agreed to stay for 3 months and transform his household in exchange for wages and a chance at something better than what she'd left behind. It was insane. It was also, somehow, already done. I'll get your trunk, Caleb said, needing to move, needing to do something with his hands. You take the main bedroom upstairs. It's got the best light. That's your room. Was my room. Not anymore. He held up a hand before she could argue. We agreed on the arrangement, Miss Whitmore. I stay in the cabin. You stay here. That's how this works. Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. All right, but I'll help with the trunk. No need. She was already heading for the door. Caleb followed, muttering under his breath about stubborn women and complicated arrangements. They carried the trunk between them up the stairs, heavier than it looked, clearly packed with everything she owned, and into the main bedroom. Caleb hadn't been in here since the week after the funeral. He'd moved his things out in a cold fury, unable to sleep in the bed where Margaret had died, unable to look at the empty cradle in the corner without feeling like his chest was caving in. Now, standing in the doorway while Clara set down her end of the trunk, he felt the memories rise like floodwater. Margaret's laugh, Samuel's cry, the smell of lavender she'd kept in sachets in the dresser, all of it gone, all of it dust. Mr. Rourke? Clara's voice pulled him back. She was watching him with something that might have been understanding. I'll let you get settled, he said roughly, backing toward the door. Tomorrow, Jack and I ride out to check the north fence line. We'll be gone most of the day. You'll have the place to yourself. All right. Caleb paused at the threshold. There's a rifle above the mantel downstairs. You know how to use one? My father taught me. I'm a fair shot. Of course she was. Good. Keep it close. We haven't had trouble in a while, but it pays to be prepared. I will. He should leave. Should let her unpack, give them both space to process this strange new arrangement. But something kept him standing there, one hand on the doorframe. Miss Whitmore, he said, that thing with Pike at the station. That won't happen here. On my land, you're under my protection. Anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. Understand? Clara's expression softened slightly. I appreciate that, Mr. Rourke. Truly. Caleb nodded, then made himself walk away before the silence got awkward. He went downstairs, out the front door, across the yard to the foreman's cabin. It was smaller than the main house, just 2 rooms and a fireplace, but it had been kept clean. Jack was particular about things being in order. Inside, Caleb stood in the dimness and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What the hell had he just agreed to? A temporary arrangement, a business transaction, 3 months to see if it worked? That's all this was. Clara needed a place to start over. He needed, what? Someone to cook his meals and clean his house? That's what he'd tell himself. That's what he'd tell Jack tomorrow when the foreman inevitably asked questions. But standing there in the cabin, looking out the window toward the main house where lamplight now glowed in the upstairs bedroom, Caleb knew it was more complicated than that. For 3 years, he'd kept the world at arm's length, worked himself numb, spoke only when necessary. Let the house fall into disrepair because maintaining it felt like an admission that he was still here, still alive, when Margaret and Samuel weren't. And then Clara Whitmore had stepped off a train and refused to leave. Refused his money. Refused his apologies. Refused to be dismissed. She'd looked at his grief-hollowed life and seen an opportunity. Not for romance, she'd made that clear, but for survival. For a chance to build something from nothing. Caleb moved to the window, watched the light in that upstairs room. Clara's silhouette passed across it once, twice, busy with the rhythms of settling in. He didn't know if this would work. Didn't know if 3 months from now they'd shake hands and part ways, or if something else would develop. But for the first time since he'd buried his family, Caleb felt something other than emptiness. Not hope, not quite, but possibility. And in the gathering darkness, with the Wyoming wind singing through the grass and the stars beginning to emerge overhead, possibility felt like enough. Set. The next morning arrived with the kind of light that made the whole territory glow gold. Caleb woke early, a habit years of ranching had made unbreakable, and dressed in the dim cabin, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up around him. Horses in the corral, cattle in the distance, the creek running somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. He stepped outside just as Jack Torres emerged from the bunkhouse, already wearing his work clothes and looking as alert as if he'd been up for hours. Jack was in his 50s, lean and weathered, with gray threading through his black hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been Caleb's foreman for 5 years, and in all that time, they'd developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and minimal conversation, which made the look Jack gave him now, part curiosity, part concern, all the more noticeable. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning." Jack walked over, glanced toward the main house. "Saw smoke from the chimney earlier. You got company?" "In a manner of speaking." Caleb sighed, knowing there was no way to explain this that wouldn't sound strange. "I hired a housekeeper. She arrived yesterday." Jack's eyebrows rose. In 5 years, the man had never shown more than mild interest in Caleb's personal life. This apparently qualified as exceptional circumstances. "A housekeeper," Jack repeated carefully. "That's right." "From town?" "From Philadelphia." Now both eyebrows were at his hairline. "Philadelphia." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "It's a temporary arrangement. 3 months. She needed work. I needed someone to manage the household. Simple as that." Jack studied him with those two knowing eyes, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling that his foreman saw right through the simplified explanation. But after a moment, Jack just nodded. "Your business," he said simply. "She know about ranch life?" "She's learning." "She got a name?" "Miss Clara Whitmore." "Miss." Jack's tone was neutral, but Caleb heard the question underneath it. "Miss?" Caleb confirmed firmly. "Like I said, it's a business arrangement." "If you say so." Jack turned toward the barn, clearly deciding the subject was closed. "We still riding the north fence line today?" "That's the plan." "Good. Wilson spotted some break in the wire yesterday. Might be nothing, might be cattle getting through. Either way, needs fixing." They fell into the familiar rhythm of morning work, checking tack, saddling horses, loading tools onto the pack horse they'd bring for repairs. The physical labor settled Caleb's mind, pushed aside the strangeness of the current situation. This was what he knew, what he was good at. The ranch didn't care about complicated arrangements or women who refused to follow the expected script. It just demanded attention, consistency, and hard work. He was tightening his saddle girth when he caught movement from the main house. Clara emerged onto the porch, carrying a basin of water that she poured over the railing into the flower bed, or what had once been a flower bed before Caleb had let it go to weeds. She wore a simple dress in a dark green color, with an apron tied over it and her hair pulled back in a practical braid. She looked up, saw him watching, and raised one hand in acknowledgement before disappearing back inside. Jack followed Caleb's gaze, then looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "She seems capable." "She is." "Good. Ranch needs someone to give a damn about the house again." Jack swung up into his saddle with the ease of long practice. "Been looking rough for a while now." It was the closest Jack had ever come to commenting on Caleb's grief. On the way, he'd let things slide. Caleb mounted his own horse, gathered the reins. Yeah, I know. They rode out as the sun cleared the horizon, the pack horse trailing behind on a lead rope. The north fence line ran along the edge of Caleb's property, marking the boundary between his land and open range. It was a constant battle keeping it maintained. Weather, animals, and simple time all worked to tear it down. The ride gave Caleb space to think, and his thoughts kept circling back to Clara, to the way she'd stood on that platform and refused to be dismissed, to the steel in her voice when she'd faced down Pike, to the practical efficiency with which she'd moved through his house last night, opening windows and making plans. She wasn't what he'd expected when he'd drunkenly filled out that matrimonial application. Hell, he didn't know what he'd expected. Someone soft, maybe. Someone looking for a husband to take care of her. Someone who'd fit into the empty spaces of his life without making him look too closely at those spaces. Clara didn't fit. She disrupted. Just her presence in his house this morning, the smoke from the chimney, the light in the windows, the purposeful activity where there'd been stillness, it changed things, made him aware of what he'd been living without. They reached the north fence around mid-morning and found the break Wilson had reported. 15 feet of wire down, torn loose from the posts, with tracks indicating that cattle had indeed pushed through. Jack dismounted and started pulling fresh wire from the pack horse while Caleb examined the damage. Not weather that did this, Jack said, running the wire through his gloved hands. Looks deliberate. Caleb crouched down, studied the torn ends. Jack was right. The wire had been cut, not broken. Someone had wanted his cattle getting through to open range. Rustlers? Caleb asked. Maybe. Or someone trying to stir up trouble. Jack began stringing the new wire between posts. You had any run-ins lately? Anyone with a grudge? Caleb thought about it. He kept to himself mostly, didn't get involved in town politics, paid his debts on time. No one I can think of. Well, someone's thinking of you. Jack secured one end of the wire, started working it tight. Might want to mention it to Sheriff Collins next time you're in town. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours, replacing the damaged section and reinforcing the posts on either side. The sun climbed high and hot, turning the grassland into a shimmer of heat and light. Caleb's shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and his hands ached from the wire work, but the familiar discomfort was grounding. This was real. This was solid. This was something he could fix with his own 2 hands. By the time they finished, it was past noon. They ate a cold lunch in the shade of a cottonwood, bread and cheese Jack had brought, washed down with water from their canteens, and then mounted up for the ride back. You want me to keep an eye out? Jack asked as they rode. For whoever cut that fence. Wouldn't hurt. Tell Wilson and the others to watch for anything unusual. Riders they don't recognize, cattle moving strange, any more damage. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon automatically. What about your housekeeper? She know to be careful? I told her to keep the rifle close. She know how to use it? Says she does. Good. Jack was quiet for a moment. She planning to stay? After the 3 months? Caleb glanced at him. Why do you ask? Just seems like a lot of trouble to go through for temporary help. Jack's tone was mild, but his point was clear. Philadelphia to Wyoming. That's not a short trip. Makes a man wonder what she's running from. Everyone's running from something, Caleb said. True enough. Jack let the subject drop, and they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. They reached the ranch as the afternoon was fading toward evening. The main house looked different somehow, more alive. Laundry hung on the line Caleb hadn't seen used in years. The porch had been swept clean, and through the open windows he could smell something cooking. Actual food. Not the beans and bacon he'd been living on, but something with depth and complexity. His stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten a real meal in longer than he cared to remember. Jack noticed it too. Smells good. Yeah. You planning to eat in the house tonight? Caleb hadn't thought about it. The arrangement was supposed to be separate. Clara in the house, him in the cabin, minimal interaction beyond what was necessary for running the household. But the smell of that cooking pulled at something in him, something human, something that remembered what it felt like to come home to a house that was warm and welcoming. I should probably check in, he said, swinging down from his horse. See if she needs anything. Jack's expression suggested he saw right through that excuse, but all he said was, "I'll handle the horses. You go on." Caleb crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on his own front door, which felt absurd but also appropriate given the circumstances. After a moment, Clara appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Rourke, come in." He stepped inside and stopped, just taking in the changes. The front hall was clean, actually clean, dust-free and polished. The main room beyond had been transformed, floors swept and mopped, furniture dusted and arranged properly. The fireplace cleared of ashes and restocked with kindling, windows that sparkled in the late afternoon light. And from the kitchen, that smell intensified, something savory and rich. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said, following his gaze. "I took the liberty of organizing things according to what made sense. If you'd prefer a different arrangement, I can—" "No, it's good." Caleb cleared his throat. "It's really good." Clara smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful neutrality she'd worn yesterday. "I'm glad you approve. Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I made stew from the beef in your cold cellar and bread from the starter I found in the pantry." "The starter still works?" "Surprisingly, yes, though I had to feed it quite a bit to bring it back to life." Caleb remembered Margaret starting that sourdough culture, remembered her pride when she'd finally gotten it to rise consistently. He'd assumed it was long dead, just another casualty of his neglect. "I wasn't sure," Clara hesitated, then continued. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to eat here, or if you'd prefer I bring something to the cabin." There it was. The question underlying everything. How much distance were they going to maintain? How separate were their lives going to be? Caleb looked around the transformed house, smelled the food cooking, saw the care Clara had already invested in making this place livable again. And he realized that maintaining complete separation wasn't just impractical. It was unkind. "I'll eat here," he said, "if that's all right with you." "Of course." "This is your home, Mr. Rourke." "Our arrangement, our rules," he corrected. "And if we're going to share meals, you should probably call me Caleb." Clara's smile widened slightly. "Then you should call me Clara." "All right then, Clara." The name felt strange on his tongue, too personal and too formal all at once. "I need to clean up. I'll be back in an hour." He retreated to the cabin, aware that something had shifted. Some line had been crossed, or maybe just redrawn. This wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. Or rather, it was a business arrangement that required more interaction than he'd initially planned. They'd be sharing space, sharing meals, sharing the daily rhythms of life on this ranch. It wouldn't be intimate. It couldn't be. But it would be something. Caleb washed up using the basin in the cabin, changed into a clean shirt, and tried not to think too hard about why he was bothering. This was just practical, just civilized. Nothing more. He returned to the main house exactly an hour later. Clara had set the kitchen table for two, and the stew was ladled into bowls that actually matched. There was fresh bread, butter, and— "Is that coffee?" Caleb asked, staring at the pot on the stove. "Real coffee," Clara confirmed. "I found your supply in the pantry. I hope you don't mind that I made some." "Mind? I haven't had decent coffee in—" He trailed off, calculating. "Too long." They sat down across from each other, and for a moment neither moved. The last time Caleb had shared a meal at this table, Margaret had been across from him, Samuel in his cradle nearby. The memory should have hurt, should have made this moment impossible, but somehow it didn't. This was different. This was Clara, who wasn't trying to replace anyone, who wasn't here out of romance or pity, who was just here eating stew in his kitchen because they'd made an arrangement. "Thank you for this," Caleb said, picking up his spoon. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's not trouble, it's my job." Clara broke off a piece of bread. "Besides, I enjoy cooking when I have decent ingredients to work with. Your pantry is better stocked than I expected." "I buy supplies in bulk. Cheaper that way, and I hate going to town." "I noticed. Some of those dried goods are older than they should be." "Still edible, though." "Barely." Clara's tone was dry. "I made a list of what needs replacing. Fresh vegetables, especially. When do you usually make supply runs?" "First Saturday of each month." "That's tomorrow." Caleb had lost track of the days. "So it is." Would you mind if I came along? I'd like to see what's available in town, get a sense of prices. The practical part of Caleb's brain recognized this as a reasonable request. The other part, the part still getting used to having someone else in his life again, tensed at the idea of bringing Clara to town, of making their arrangement public, of fielding the questions and stares that would inevitably come. But he'd agreed to this, and Clara deserved to know her way around, deserved to be treated like a full participant in running this household. Sure, he said, we'll leave early. Town's an hour ride. I'll be ready. They ate in comfortable silence after that, and Caleb found himself actually tasting his food for the first time in years. The stew was rich and well-seasoned, the bread had a perfect crust, and the coffee was strong enough to make him remember why he'd once looked forward to breakfast. When they finished, Clara stood to clear the plates, but Caleb stopped her. I'll help, he said. She looked surprised. You don't have to. Fair's fair. You cooked, I'll clean. They worked side by side at the sink, Clara washing while Caleb dried, and the domesticity of it should have felt strange, but somehow didn't. It just felt normal, like something people did together when they shared a space. How is the fence line? Clara asked as she scrubbed a bowl. Needs work. Someone cut the wire deliberately. Her hand stilled. Someone sabotaging your property? Looks that way. Jack thinks it might be rustlers or someone with a grudge. Do you know who? No idea, but we'll keep watch. Caleb took the bowl from her, dried it carefully. I told you to keep the rifle close. I meant it. If anyone comes around when I'm not here, anyone you don't recognize, don't hesitate to use it. Clara nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not trying to scare you, just want you prepared. I appreciate that. She handed him another dish. My father used to say the frontier rewarded preparedness and punished assumptions. Your father was right. They finished the dishes, and Caleb found himself reluctant to leave. The cabin was waiting, quiet and empty, but this kitchen was warm. This kitchen had life in it. I should let you get some rest, he said finally, hanging up the dish towel. Tomorrow will be a long day. All right, good night, Caleb. Good night, Clara. He walked back to the cabin as the last light faded from the sky, and for the first time since Margaret and Samuel died, the ranch didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a place where people lived, where things happened, where tomorrow mattered, because there was someone else to consider, someone else whose presence made the silence less absolute. Caleb lay in the narrow cabin bed and listened to the night sounds, crickets, distant cattle, the wind in the grass. And from the main house, barely audible, the sound of Clara moving around upstairs, settling in for the night. 3 months, he'd told her. 3 months to see if this worked. He closed his eyes and thought maybe, just maybe, it already was. The ride into town the next morning started in silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves against packed earth. Clara sat beside Caleb on the bench seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the grassland roll past with the focused attention of someone cataloging everything for future reference. She'd dressed practically, a dark blue traveling dress with sturdy boots and a bonnet that shaded her face from the already climbing sun. Caleb kept his eyes on the road ahead, but he was acutely aware of her presence beside him. The way she sat straight-backed even when the wagon jolted over rough patches. The way she didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter like some women might have. She seemed comfortable with quiet, which made two of them. About 20 minutes into the journey, Clara finally spoke. Tell me about the town. What should I expect? Caleb considered the question. It's small, maybe 300 people, counting the ranches in the surrounding area. One main street with the usual, general store, bank, saloon, hotel, sheriff's office, church at the north end, Doc Pemberton's office above the barber shop. And the people? Mostly good folks, some busybodies who'll want to know your whole life story, a few troublemakers like Pike, but the sheriff keeps them in line for the most part. He glanced at her. They'll talk about you, about us, the arrangement. I assumed they would. Clara's tone was matter-of-fact. Small towns are the same everywhere, east or west. Everyone knows everyone's business, and what they don't know, they'll invent. Doesn't bother you? Not particularly. I learned a long time ago that people will think what they want regardless of the truth, All I can control is my own behavior." She adjusted her bonnet against a gust of wind. "Though I imagine it might bother you more. You've lived here longer, have more invested in your reputation." Caleb thought about that. His reputation in town had been built over years: solid rancher, reliable neighbor, tragic widower. Adding "man who hired a mail-order bride as a housekeeper" to that list would certainly generate conversation. But Clara was right. People would think what they wanted. He could either waste energy trying to control the narrative or just live his life and let them talk. "Let them think what they want," he said finally. "We know the truth of it." Clara smiled slightly, and they fell back into comfortable silence. The town appeared on the horizon about 40 minutes later, a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the road, with the church steeple rising above the rest like a pointing finger. As they drew closer, Caleb could see the Saturday morning activity already in full swing. Wagons lined the main street, families doing their weekly shopping, men gathered outside the saloon despite the early hour, children running between buildings in some elaborate game that involved a lot of shouting. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of Morrison's general store and set the brake. Before he could move to help Clara down, she'd already descended on her own, brushing dust from her skirt with efficient movements. "I have my list," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "Should I wait for you, or—" "Go ahead and start shopping. I need to stop by the bank and the feed store. I'll meet you back here in about an hour." Clara nodded and headed into the store while Caleb crossed the street toward the bank. He'd only made it halfway when a familiar voice stopped him. "Caleb Rourke. Heard you had some interesting news." He turned to find Martha Henderson, the town's unofficial information hub and primary source of gossip, bearing down on him with a smile that was equal parts friendly and predatory. She was in her 50s, round and robust, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Morning, Martha." "Don't you morning Martha me. Is it true you've got a woman staying at your place? A woman from back east?" Word traveled fast. Caleb should have expected it. "It's true. I hired a housekeeper." "A housekeeper?" Martha's tone suggested she found this explanation as believable as a story about flying cattle. "And where exactly did you find this housekeeper?" "Through an agency." "What kind of agency?" Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "The kind that arranges employment, Martha. Now, if you'll excuse me." "Oh, don't be prickly. I'm just curious, like everyone else." Martha softened her approach slightly. "It's good to see you taking an interest in living again, Caleb. That house needed tending, and you needed someone to tend it. If folks want to gossip, that's their problem." It was as close to a blessing as he was likely to get from Martha Henderson, and Caleb recognized it as such. "Appreciate that." "Is she here today? Your housekeeper?" "She's in Morrison's." Martha's eyes lit up with interest. "Well then, I'd better go introduce myself. Can't have a new woman in town without a proper welcome." She bustled off toward the general store, and Caleb watched her go with mixed feelings. Martha could be nosy and intrusive, but she also had a good heart. If she decided to welcome Clara rather than interrogate her, it might actually help smooth things over with the rest of the town. He continued to the bank, conducted his business quickly, then headed to the feed store to order supplies for the ranch. By the time he finished and made his way back to Morrison's, nearly an hour had passed. Inside the store, he found Clara at the counter with Mr. Morrison, going through her list with systematic efficiency. Martha Henderson stood nearby, clearly having completed her inspection and deemed Clara acceptable because she was now telling some elaborate story about her nephew's wedding. And the cake just collapsed, right there during the reception. 3 tears of disaster, I tell you. Poor bride nearly cried, "Oh, Caleb, there you are." Clara looked up, and something in her expression suggested she was grateful for the interruption. "I've got everything on my list. Mr. Morrison's adding it up now." "Take your time." Caleb nodded to Morrison, a thin man in his 60s who'd run the store for as long as Caleb could remember. "How are things, John?" "Can't complain. Your housekeeper here knows her way around a supply list. Very thorough." Morrison scribbled numbers on a piece of paper, his pencil scratching. "Comes to $23.40. Caleb pulled out his wallet, but Clara spoke up. "Could you put it on Mr. Rourke's account?" He mentioned setting one up. Morrison looked to Caleb for confirmation. Caleb nodded. "That's fine. Add it to my monthly tab." "Will do." Morrison made a note in his ledger. I'll have my boy load everything into your wagon. While they waited for the supplies to be loaded, Martha launched into another story, this one about a dispute over fence lines between two neighboring ranchers. Clara listened politely, occasionally asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Caleb found himself watching her navigate the conversation, the way she drew Martha out without revealing much about herself, the way she smiled at the right moments and nodded at the appropriate times. She was good at this, good at managing people without them realizing they were being managed. Well, I should let you two get on with your day, Martha said finally. Clara, it was lovely meeting you. You must come to church tomorrow. Reverend Walsh gives a fine sermon, and it's a good way to meet folks. I'll consider it, Clara said diplomatically. After Martha left, Clara turned to Caleb with a slightly bemused expression. Is she always that enthusiastic? Always, but she means well. And if Martha Henderson approves of you, the rest of the town will follow. Good to know. Clara glanced out the window toward the wagon, where Morrison's son was loading the last of their supplies. Are we done here, or do you have other stops? Just one more. The sheriff's office. I need to report that cut fence. They walked together down the wooden sidewalk, and Caleb was conscious of the stares following them. Not hostile, just curious. The sight of Caleb Rourke walking beside a woman who wasn't Margaret, that was news. That was something worth watching. The sheriff's office sat near the end of the main street, a squat building with bars on the windows and a sign that read Sheriff T. Collins in faded paint. Caleb pushed open the door, and Clara followed him inside. Sheriff Tom Collins looked up from his desk, a pile of paperwork spread before him and a coffee cup leaving rings on the wood. He was in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with people at their worst. Caleb, what brings you in? Then Collins noticed Clara, and his eyebrows rose. And who's this? This is Miss Clara Whitmore. She's managing my household. Clara, Sheriff Tom Collins. Ma'am? Collins stood, nodded politely. Welcome to town. Thank you, Sheriff. What can I do for you, Caleb? Caleb explained about the cut fence, the cattle getting through, his suspicion that it had been deliberate. Collins listened carefully, making notes, his expression growing more serious. That's the third report this month, Collins said when Caleb finished. Different ranches, but same pattern. Someone's cutting fences, spooking cattle, causing trouble. You think it's rustlers? Maybe. Or someone trying to stir up conflict between ranchers, make us fight each other while they work around the edges. Collins tapped his pencil against the desk. I've been riding the circuit more trying to catch whoever's responsible. Haven't had any luck yet. You need deputies, Clara said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. She stood with her hands folded, calm and composed, but Caleb could see the sharp intelligence working behind her eyes. Ma'am, Collins said, you're covering too much territory alone. Whoever's doing this knows your patterns, knows when you'll be where. They're working around you. Clara's gaze was steady. If you had deputies, even just temporary ones, you could cover more ground, vary your routes, make it harder for them to predict where you'll be. Collins stared at her for a long moment, then looked at Caleb. She's right. I know she is. Problem is, the town council won't fund deputy positions. Says the budget's too tight. Collins sighed, set down his pencil. I do what I can with what I have. What about volunteers, Clara suggested. Ranchers who've been affected could take turns riding with you. They have a vested interest in stopping whoever's doing this. Collins considered that, then slowly nodded. That might work, at least until we catch whoever's responsible. He looked at Caleb. You interested? I'll do a few shifts, Caleb said, and I'll ask Jack if he's willing. Appreciate it. Collins made another note. I'll talk to the other ranchers who've reported problems. If we can get a rotation going, we might actually catch these bastards. Pardon my language, ma'am. I've heard worse, Clara said dryly. They left the sheriff's office and headed back to the wagon. The sun had climbed higher, turning the morning heat into something more substantial. Caleb helped Clara up to the bench seat this time. She led him, which felt like a small victory, and they started the journey back to the ranch. They were about 15 minutes outside of town when Clara spoke again. That was productive. The sheriff's visit? All of it. I got the supplies I needed, met some of the townspeople, and we potentially helped solve a problem. She glanced at him. Though I hope I didn't overstep by making suggestions to the sheriff. You didn't. Your idea about volunteers was smart. It was obvious anyone paying attention would have seen the same solution. Maybe. But you were the one who said it out loud. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. You don't have to downplay your intelligence, Clara. Not with me. She was quiet for a moment. In Philadelphia, women who spoke their minds were considered unfeminine, unmarriageable. My aunt used to say I'd never find a husband if I kept offering opinions no one asked for. Your aunt was wrong. Was she? I'm 24 and unmarried, traveling across the country to work as a housekeeper for a widowed rancher. Not exactly what society considers a successful outcome. Caleb heard the edge in her voice. Not quite bitterness, but something close, pain wrapped in practical acceptance. Society's definition of success is pretty narrow. Seems to me you escaped a life you didn't want, made your own choice, and ended up somewhere you can build something new. That takes courage. Clara turned to look at him, and he felt the weight of her gaze even though he kept his eyes on the road. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more, distant, maybe. Harder. You lost your family after all. I thought you'd be bitter. I am bitter. Some days more than others. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. But bitter doesn't mean cruel. Doesn't mean I can't recognize intelligence when I see it, or appreciate someone speaking their mind. That's refreshing. They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, more comfortable, more honest. The ranch appeared in the distance, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest at the sight of it. For 3 years, coming home had meant returning to emptiness, to rooms full of ghosts, to the slow grind of days that all looked the same. But now there was smoke from the chimney, laundry on the line, a subtle sense of life that hadn't been there before. Clara had done that. In just 2 days, she'd brought his house back from the dead. He pulled the wagon up near the porch, and they both climbed down. Jack emerged from the barn, saw them, and walked over to help with the supplies. How was town? Jack asked, already reaching for one of the crates. Productive, Caleb said, echoing Clara's earlier assessment. We need to talk later about the sheriff's volunteer deputy program. Jack raised an eyebrow but just nodded. Sure thing. They unloaded the wagon in comfortable cooperation, carrying boxes and sacks into the house, while Clara directed them to the appropriate places. Pantry for the dry goods, cold cellar for the perishables, kitchen counter for the items she'd need immediately. By the time they finished, the sun was high and hot, and Caleb's shirt stuck to his back with sweat. I'll make lunch, Clara said, already tying on her apron. Give me 20 minutes. Jack looked at Caleb with an expression that clearly said we need to talk, so Caleb followed him back outside while Clara got to work in the kitchen. They walked toward the barn, out of earshot of the house. She's settling in all right? Jack asked. Seems to be. Town folks give her any trouble? Martha Henderson interrogated her. Clara handled it fine. Jack nodded slowly, studying Caleb with those two perceptive eyes. You doing all right with all this? Having someone in the house again? It was the most personal question Jack had ever asked him, and Caleb had to think about how to answer. It's strange, but not bad strange, just different. Different can be good. Can be. Jack seemed to sense Caleb wasn't ready to dig deeper into his feelings, so he shifted topics. What's this about a volunteer deputy program? Caleb explained the situation with the cut fences, the sheriff's limited resources, and Clara's suggestion about ranchers taking turns riding patrol. Jack listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. Makes sense, Jack said when Caleb finished. I'll do a few shifts if Collins wants me. Might be good to catch whoever's causing trouble before they escalate. That's what I figured. They stood in the barn doorway looking out at the land stretching away in all directions. This was Caleb's kingdom, 3,000 acres of grass and sky, cattle and horses, hard work and harder winters. He'd built it with Margaret, lost her here, kept it running through sheer stubbornness and the inability to imagine doing anything else. Now Clara was here, adding her own touches, making her own mark. And instead of feeling like an intrusion, it felt like possibility. Jack, Caleb said quietly. You ever think about starting over after you've lost everything? Jack was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old grief. Every day for the first 5 years after my wife died. Thought about selling everything, moving somewhere nobody knew me, becoming someone different. Caleb hadn't known Jack was a widower. In 5 years of working together, they'd never discussed their personal histories in any detail. What stopped you? Realized I was still the same person no matter where I went. Same memories. Same pain. Running doesn't change that. Jack glanced at him. But that doesn't mean you can't build something new alongside the old. Doesn't mean life can't surprise you again. Before Caleb could respond, Clara appeared on the porch, waving them inside. Lunch is ready. They crossed the yard together, and as Caleb climbed the porch steps, he caught the smell of cooking, something savory and rich that made his mouth water. Inside, Clara had set the table with sandwiches, fresh vegetables from the supplies they'd bought, and cold lemonade she must have made while they were talking. You didn't have to go to all this trouble, Caleb said. It wasn't trouble. Sit down before it gets cold. They ate together, Caleb, Clara, and Jack, in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Clara asked Jack about the ranch operations, and he explained the current work schedule with the ease of someone who knew his subject inside and out. She listened attentively, asked intelligent questions, and gradually Caleb saw Jack warm to her the same way Martha Henderson had. Clara had that effect, he was starting to realize. She didn't demand acceptance or try too hard to please. She just existed with calm competence, and people responded to that authenticity. After lunch, Jack headed back to work, and Caleb helped Clara clear the table. They worked side by side in comfortable silence until all the dishes were washed and put away. I should get back to work too, Caleb said, though part of him wanted to stay in this warm kitchen, in this easy companionship. We're moving cattle to the south pasture this afternoon. All right, I'll be here when you get back. Clara paused, then added, Caleb, thank you for taking me to town today, for introducing me to people. It's practical. You need to know your way around. Still, I appreciate it. She smiled, and there was genuine warmth in it. You're a good man. Better than you think you are. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and headed back outside. But her words stayed with him as he worked through the afternoon, moving cattle, checking water sources, riding the fence lines with Jack to look for more damage. You're a good man. Better than you think you are. Was he? He'd spent 3 years barely living, letting his house fall apart, avoiding any connection that might require him to feel something beyond grief. That didn't seem particularly good. It seemed like the bare minimum of survival. But maybe Clara saw something he couldn't. Maybe from her perspective, someone who'd walked away from her own difficult situation, the simple act of not giving up looked like strength. They finished the cattle work as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Caleb and Jack rode back to the ranch together, horses tired and riders satisfied with a day's work done well. She's good for you, Jack said out of nowhere as they approached the barn. Caleb looked at him. What? Miss Whitmore. She's good for you. I can see it already. You're more present, more alive. Jack's expression was serious. Don't fight it just because you're scared. I'm not. Yes, you are. And that's fine. Being scared is human. But don't let it stop you from living, Caleb. Margaret wouldn't want that. Samuel wouldn't want that. The names hit like physical blows, but not in the way they used to. Not with the sharp-edged agony that made Caleb want to shut down completely. Just with weight, with memory, with the bittersweet ache of love that had nowhere to go. I know, Caleb said quietly. I know they wouldn't. Jack nodded, clearly satisfied he'd said his piece, and they spent the next 20 minutes tending the horses in silence. By the time Caleb headed to the cabin to clean up for dinner, the sky had deepened to purple, and the first stars were emerging. Inside the cabin, he washed his face and hands, changed into a clean shirt, and stood at the window looking toward the main house. Light glowed in the kitchen windows. He could see Clara's silhouette moving around, preparing the evening meal. He thought about Jack's words, about being scared, about living. The truth was, Clara did scare him, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. The possibility of caring again, of investing in another person, of opening himself up to the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him 3 years ago. But she also made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in too long, made him taste his food again. Notice when the house was clean. Think about tomorrow as something other than just another day to get through. That was worth being scared for. Caleb crossed the yard to the main house, knocked once, and entered when Clara called out a welcome. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, the table set for two, and Clara stood at the stove stirring something in a pot. "Perfect timing," she said. "Dinner's just about ready." "What are we having?" "Chicken and dumplings. I found a hen in your coop that looked ready for retirement." Caleb smiled despite himself. "Practical and efficient." "I try." They sat down to eat, and the meal was every bit as good as the smell had promised. The chicken was tender, the dumplings fluffy, and the broth rich with herbs Clara must have brought from town. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Clara spoke. "I've been thinking about the fence-cutting situation." Caleb looked up. "Yeah?" "If it's rustlers, they'll need somewhere to keep the stolen cattle before they can sell them, somewhere isolated, where they won't be easily spotted." Clara set down her spoon, her expression thoughtful. "Are there any abandoned properties nearby? Old ranches or homesteads that didn't work out?" Caleb thought about it. "There's the old Hutchins place about 10 miles northeast. Family gave up after 2 bad winters. Been empty for a year now." "That would be worth checking. Abandoned buildings, existing corrals far enough from town that no one pays attention." "I'll mention it to Sheriff Collins. Maybe ride out there with the next patrol." Caleb studied her across the table. "You have a tactical mind, Clara. Where'd you learn to think like that?" "My father was a Union officer during the war. He died when I was young, but before that, he used to tell me stories about strategy, about outthinking your opponent." Clara's expression grew distant. "He said most problems could be solved if you just asked the right questions." "Sounds like a smart man." "He was. I wish I'd had more time with him." They finished the meal in thoughtful silence, and afterward Caleb helped with the dishes again. It was becoming a routine, this evening ritual of cleaning up together. Something normal. Something that felt like the foundation of something larger. When the last dish was dried and put away, Caleb found himself reluctant to leave. The cabin felt even emptier now than it had before Clara arrived, and this kitchen felt like where he was supposed to be. But he'd set the boundaries of their arrangement, and it felt important to maintain them. Clara had her space, he had his. That's what they'd agreed to. "I should let you rest," he said, hanging up the dish towel. "Caleb?" Clara's voice stopped him at the doorway. He turned. She stood by the table, lamplight catching in her hair, her expression unreadable. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad I stayed. These 2 days have been good, better than I expected." Something warm unfurled in Caleb's chest. "Yeah, they have been." "Good night." "Good night, Clara." He walked back to the cabin through the gathering darkness, and for the first time in 3 years, he went to sleep not thinking about what he'd lost, but about what might be possible. About a woman who'd refused to leave when he'd tried to send her away. About a house that was slowly coming back to life. About the terrifying, exhilarating prospect of caring again. 3 months, he'd said. Just a trial period. But as Caleb drifted off to sleep, he was starting to suspect that 3 months wasn't going to be nearly long enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Caleb. He woke before dawn, worked the ranch until his muscles ached, shared meals with Clara that grew longer as they discovered more to talk about, then retreated to the cabin each night telling himself he was maintaining appropriate boundaries. But the boundaries were getting harder to justify, and he knew it. Clara transformed more than just the house. She brought order to the chaos Caleb had been living in, organized the pantry by category, mended clothes he'd been meaning to fix for months, even started a vegetable garden behind the house using seeds she'd bought in town. She worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, and somehow still found time to read in the evenings, sitting on the porch with a book she'd brought from Philadelphia. More than once, Caleb found himself watching her from the cabin window, the way lamplight caught in her hair when she turned pages, the small smile that crossed her face when she read something that pleased her. He told himself it was just observation, just awareness of another person sharing his space, but he was lying to himself, and he knew that too. It was early July when Sheriff Collins organized the first volunteer patrol. Caleb rode out with him on a Wednesday afternoon, both men armed and alert, covering the territory between three ranches that had reported fence cutting. They checked the old Hutchins place Clara had suggested, found it empty but with signs of recent activity, fresh horse tracks in the dust, cigarette butts that hadn't weathered much. "Someone's been here," Collins said, dismounting to examine the tracks more closely. "Within the last few days, I'd say." Caleb circled the abandoned homestead, noting the broken corral fence and the trampled grass near what had once been the barn. "Good place to hide stolen cattle temporarily, remote enough that nobody comes out here. We should stake it out, see if they come back." They did exactly that, spending the next 2 nights camped in the hills overlooking the property, taking turns on watch. It was uncomfortable and cold and ultimately fruitless. Whoever had been using the place didn't return while they were there. But on the third day, riding back to town, they spotted something that made both men pull up short. A group of riders moving cattle across open range, heading east toward the territorial border. Too far away to identify, but moving with the purposeful speed of men who didn't want to be seen. "That's Harrison's cattle," Collins said, squinting into the distance. "I recognize the brand from here." "You want to go after them?" "Not with just 2 of us. They're too far ahead and we don't know how many there are." Collins swore under his breath. "But at least we know they're moving east. I'll wire the marshal in Cheyenne, see if we can intercept them at the border." They rode hard back to town, and Caleb helped Collins draft the telegram before heading home. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was setting and exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. He'd been gone 3 days, sleeping rough and eating cold food, and all he wanted was a hot meal and his own bed. But when he crested the rise and saw the ranch spread out below, something made him pull his horse to a stop. Clara stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes as she looked toward the road, waiting. When she spotted him, she lowered her hand but didn't move, just watched him approach with an expression he couldn't quite read from this distance. Caleb urged his horse forward, and as he drew closer, he could see the tension in Clara's shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. She'd been worried. The realization hit him with unexpected force. He dismounted in front of the porch, and Clara came down the steps to meet him. "You're back," she said, and her voice carried relief she didn't quite manage to hide. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" "You said 2 days. It's been 3. Clara's hands twisted in her apron. "I know you don't owe me explanations, but I was concerned." Something warm expanded in Caleb's chest. When was the last time someone had worried about him, really worried, not just out of politeness or obligation, but because they cared whether he came home safe? "We found tracks at the Hutchins place. Decided to stake it out for a couple nights." He loosened his horse's girth, suddenly aware of how filthy he was. 3 days of dust and sweat coating his skin. "Didn't catch anyone, but we spotted rustlers moving cattle east. Collins is coordinating with the marshal now." "So it was rustlers." "Looks that way." Clara nodded, some of the tension easing from her posture. "You must be exhausted and hungry. I kept dinner warm. I wasn't sure when you'd be back, but I hoped—" She trailed off, and Caleb found himself smiling despite his exhaustion. "Give me 20 minutes to clean up. I'll be right in." He took care of his horse first, unsaddled, brushed, fed, and watered, because that's what you did no matter how tired you were. Then he went to the cabin, scrubbed off 3 days of grime, and changed into clean clothes. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man who looked rough around the edges, stubble darkening his jaw, lines of fatigue around his eyes. But there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been there a month ago. Purpose, maybe. Or the beginning of it. When he entered the house, Clara had dinner laid out. Roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from her garden. The kitchen was warm and smelled like home, in a way that made Caleb's throat tight. "This is too much trouble," he said, sitting down. "It's not trouble. It's my job." But the way Clara said it suggested it was more than that. More than just employment. "Besides, you've been sleeping on the ground for 3 nights. You deserve a proper meal." They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Clara spoke again. "Jack told me about the volunteer patrols. He's been riding with Collins, too." "He mention anything else?" "Just that it's dangerous work. That the men you're looking for won't hesitate to shoot if cornered." Clara's eyes met his across the table. He also said you're one of the best shots in the county, so I shouldn't worry. Jack talks too much. He cares about you, and he wanted me to understand that you know what you're doing out there. But Caleb set down his fork, studied Clara's face in the lamplight. Does it bother you? The danger? Yes. She didn't hesitate, didn't try to downplay it. I know it's not my place to. We have an arrangement, and it's not like I have any claim on your safety. But yes, it bothers me. The thought of you getting hurt bothers me more than it probably should. The honesty in her voice made something shift in Caleb's chest. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, the growing connection neither of them had planned for, the way their temporary arrangement was starting to feel permanent. Here it was, finally said out loud. Clara, you don't have to say anything. Clara stood abruptly, started clearing dishes. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not expecting anything to change. I just wanted you to know that someone gives a damn whether you come home. Caleb stood too, caught her hand before she could retreat completely. She stilled, looking down at their joined hands with an expression that was part surprise, part hope. I'm glad you care, he said quietly. And for what it's worth, knowing you were here waiting, it made me more careful out there, made me want to come home. Clara's breath caught. Caleb. He should let go of her hand, should step back, maintain the distance they'd so carefully constructed. But he didn't want to. For the first time in 3 years, he wanted to close the distance instead. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and Caleb was just about to say something, what, he wasn't sure, when they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. They broke apart, both turning toward the window. Through the gathering darkness, Caleb could see a rider coming hard, kicking up dust. Stay inside, he told Clara, already moving toward the door. Caleb, please. He stepped onto the porch, hand resting on the revolver at his hip, and waited as the rider came into view. It was one of Sheriff Collins' temporary deputies, a young ranch hand named Miller, and from the way he rode, something was seriously wrong. Miller pulled up hard, his horse lathered and breathing hard. Mr. Rourke, Sheriff needs you, now. What happened? Rustlers hit the Taylor place tonight. They didn't just take cattle, they burned the barn, shot Mr. Taylor when he tried to stop them. Doc's with him now, but it's bad. Caleb's blood went cold. The Taylors were his nearest neighbors, good people who'd always been fair in their dealings. How many rustlers? 4, maybe 5. They rode north after the shooting. Sheriff's forming a posse. He wants every man who can ride and shoot. Give me 5 minutes. Miller nodded and wheeled his horse around, heading toward Jack's cabin to spread the word. Caleb turned back to the house and found Clara standing in the doorway, her face pale. I heard, she said. I have to go. I know. Clara disappeared into the house, came back carrying his rifle and a canvas bag. I packed food, ammunition, and bandages, just in case. Caleb took the bag, struck by her calm efficiency even in crisis. Lock the doors after I leave. Keep the rifle close. I will. If anyone comes, anyone you don't know, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand? Yes. He should go. Should already be saddling his horse, joining the others, but he stood there looking at Clara, memorizing her face in the lamplight, suddenly very aware that riding after armed rustlers in the dark was exactly the kind of thing that got men killed. Be careful, Clara said softly. I will. Then, without thinking about it, without planning it, Caleb stepped forward and kissed her forehead. Just a brief touch, barely more than a brush of lips against skin, but it felt like crossing a chasm. Clara's eyes widened, her hand coming up to touch the spot he'd kissed. Come back, she said, and it sounded like both a command and a prayer. I'll try. Caleb forced himself to turn away, to cross to the barn where Jack was already saddling horses. They worked in tense silence, checking weapons, loading ammunition, preparing for whatever they'd find when they caught up to the rustlers. The posse assembled quickly, Caleb, Jack, Miller, and 5 other ranch hands from neighboring properties. Sheriff Collins met them on the road, and they rode north through darkness broken only by starlight, following the trail the rustlers had left. They found the Taylor place lit up by the dying flames of the barn. neighbors already there trying to salvage what they could. Mrs. Taylor sat on the porch, her face streaked with tears, while Doc Pemberton worked on her husband inside the house. Collins dismounted, spoke briefly with Mrs. Taylor, then returned to the posse. "He's alive, but barely. Took a bullet to the chest. Doc says the next few hours will tell." "The men who did this?" someone asked. "Headed north, like Miller said. We've got maybe an hour lead on them, maybe less." Collins looked at each of them in turn. "This isn't just about cattle anymore. They shot a man. That makes them dangerous, willing to kill. Anyone who wants to turn back, no judgment." No one moved. "All right then, let's ride." They pushed north through the darkness, Collins setting a brutal pace. The trail was easy to follow. The rustlers weren't bothering to hide their tracks, confident in their head start. But they hadn't counted on how fast word would spread, or how quickly a posse could form. 2 hours into the pursuit, one of the ranch hands spotted something ahead, the glow of a campfire in a ravine, partially hidden by cottonwoods. Collins called a halt, and they dismounted, approaching on foot. Through the trees, Caleb could see 5 men around the fire, their horses picketed nearby. They were laughing, passing a bottle, completely unaware they'd been followed. Arrogant, stupid, dangerous. Collins gathered the posse close, kept his voice to a whisper. "We surround them, quiet as we can. On my signal, we call for surrender. They resist, we shoot. Everyone clear?" Nods all around. They spread out, moving through the darkness with the careful silence of men who'd hunted all their lives. Caleb found a position behind a fallen log, rifle aimed at the campfire, heart pounding steady in his chest. This was the moment, the knife's edge between talking these men down and a gunfight that could leave anyone dead. Collins' voice cut through the night. "This is Sheriff Tom Collins. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons and put your hands up." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then one of the rustlers went for his gun. The ravine erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning. The sharp crack of rifles mixed with men shouting, horses screaming. Caleb fired twice, saw one rustler go down. To his left, Jack's rifle barked steadily. The rustlers scattered, some diving for cover, others running for their horses. One made it to his mount, swung up into the saddle. Caleb tracked him with the rifle, finger on the trigger, but the man was already galloping away into the darkness, and Caleb couldn't bring himself to shoot someone in the back, even a rustler. The gunfight lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it ended, 3 rustlers lay dead or dying by the fire. One was wounded and being tied up by Miller, and one had escaped into the night. Caleb stood slowly, rifle still ready, ears ringing from the gunfire. Around the ravine, the other posse members were emerging from cover, checking the bodies, securing weapons. Collins moved among the rustlers with professional efficiency, confirming deaths, searching for identification. "Anyone hurt?" Collins called out. A chorus of negatives came back. They'd been lucky. The surprise had given them the advantage, and the rustlers had been drunk enough to shoot poorly. Jack appeared at Caleb's side, blood on his sleeve. "You hit?" "No. You?" "Just a graze. Bastard's bullet clipped me on the way past." Jack pressed a hand to his arm, grimaced. "I'll live." They worked through the night, securing the bodies, gathering evidence, rounding up the stolen cattle that had been hidden in a box canyon nearby. By the time they rode back to the Taylor place with the captured rustler and the recovered livestock, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. Doc Pemberton met them with news. Taylor would live. The bullet had missed anything vital, and with rest and care, he'd make a full recovery. Mrs. M. Taylor wept with relief, and the whole group felt the tension ease slightly. One of the dead rustlers was identified as Vernon Pike. The drunk who'd accosted Clara at the train station had apparently graduated from harassment to theft and murder. Caleb felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no regret. Just a cold recognition that Pike had made his choices and paid for them. The captured rustler was locked in the town jail, and Collins promised a trial within the week. The one who'd escaped was still out there somewhere, but Collins figured he'd crossed into the next territory and wouldn't be back anytime soon. By the time Caleb and Jack made it back to the ranch, the sun was fully up, and exhaustion sat like a physical weight on Caleb's shoulders. 3 days of patrol followed by a night of tracking and gunfighting. He was running on nothing but willpower. But as they crested the rise and the ranch came into view, Caleb saw Clara on the porch again, waiting. And despite the exhaustion, despite everything that had happened, he felt something lift in his chest. He was home, and someone was waiting. He dismounted stiffly, legs protesting after hours in the saddle. Clara came down the steps, her eyes scanning him for injuries, and when she saw the blood on his shirt, not his own, just spatter from the gunfight, her face went pale. "I'm not hurt," he said quickly. "It's not my blood." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Jack got grazed, but I'm fine." Claire's eyes moved to Jack, who was slowly dismounting with one hand pressed to his arm. "Come inside, both of you. I'll clean that wound and make breakfast." "Ma'am, I can just go to the cabin," Jack started. "You'll come inside and let me help, or I'll follow you to the cabin and help there. Your choice." Jack looked at Caleb, who just shrugged. "She's stubborn." "I'd do what she says." They went inside and Clara set to work with calm efficiency, cleaning Jack's wound, which was indeed just a graze, and bandaging it properly while water heated for coffee. She didn't ask questions about the night, didn't demand details. She just took care of them with the kind of quiet competence that spoke louder than words. After Jack's arm was bandaged, Clara sent him to rest with a plate of food and turned her attention to Caleb. "Strip off that shirt. I need to make sure you're really not injured. Clara, I told you, and I need to verify it with my own eyes, please." The please undid his protest. Caleb pulled off the blood-stained shirt, stood bare-chested in the kitchen, while Clara examined him with a clinical eye that still made his skin warm under her gaze. She checked his arms, his chest, his back, thorough and methodical. "You're right. No injuries." Relief flooded her voice. "Though you have bruises forming on your shoulder. From the rifle kick?" "Probably. Sit down, I'll make coffee." Caleb sat at the kitchen table while Clara moved around preparing breakfast, and the domesticity of it struck him. He'd just spent the night in a gunfight, had watched men die, had nearly died himself. And now here he was in his kitchen, watching a woman make coffee, feeling safer and more at peace than he had any right to. "Did you catch them?" Clara asked, setting a cup in front of him. "Most of them. 3 dead, 1 captured, 1 escaped. We recovered the cattle. Taylor's going to live." "Thank God." "Pike was one of them, the drunk from the station." Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "The one who grabbed me?" "Yeah. He won't be grabbing anyone else." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "I should probably feel something about that. Relief, maybe, or vindication, but I just feel tired. That's normal. Violence is exhausting, even when you're not the one doing it." Clara poured her own coffee, sat down across from him. In the morning light streaming through the windows, she looked tired too, shadows under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept while he was gone. They sat in silence, drinking coffee, and Caleb felt the events of the night settling into his bones. He'd killed a man, maybe 2, hard to tell in the chaos who'd shot who. He should feel something about that. Guilt, horror, something. But all he felt was a grim satisfaction that they'd stopped the rustlers before anyone else got hurt. "Caleb?" Clara's voice pulled him back. "Where did you go just now?" "Just thinking." "About the fight?" "About a lot of things." He looked at her across the table. "About how I kissed your forehead before I left? And how that probably crossed a line we'd drawn." Clara's breath caught. "Did it feel like crossing a line?" "No, it felt right. That's what scares me." "Why does it scare you?" Caleb set down his coffee cup, tried to find words for feelings he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Bodas." "'Cause when I wrote to that agency, I was at the bottom of everything, lost and alone and so goddamn tired of feeling nothing. I thought maybe a wife, a companion, someone to talk to, maybe that would help. But I didn't think about what it would cost. What it would cost. To care again. To invest in another person. To open myself up to the possibility of losing someone I—" He stopped, the word catching in his throat. "Someone you what?" Clara's voice was gentle, encouraging. "Someone I'm starting to care about more than our arrangement allows." The words hung between them, honest and terrifying. Clara didn't look away, didn't dismiss them. She just met his gaze with those steady gray blue eyes and said, "What if I'm starting to feel the same way?" Caleb's heart stuttered. "Clara, I came here thinking this was just employment, a fresh start, nothing more. But somewhere between your stubborn decency and the way you look at me like I'm a person instead of a problem, I started caring too." She leaned forward slightly. "And yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it complicates everything, but pretending it's not happening won't make it go away. So what do we do about it? I don't know. Maybe we just acknowledge it. Stop pretending we're indifferent. See where that leads." It was the most honest conversation they'd had since she arrived, and Caleb felt something in his chest unfurl, something that had been clenched tight for 3 years, finally allowing itself to breathe. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "Being close to someone. Opening up. I've spent so long keeping everyone at a distance. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for honesty." Caleb reached across the table, took her hand. Her palm was warm against his, calloused from work, but still somehow soft. "Then here's my honesty. I think about you more than I should. When I'm working, when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm riding patrol in the dark. You're there, in my head, making me want to come home instead of just exist." Clara's eyes glistened. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. It's just the truth." They sat there holding hands across the kitchen table as the morning sun climbed higher, and Caleb felt the weight of 3 years of grief begin to shift. Not disappear, it would never completely disappear, but shift enough to make room for something new, something like hope. The days following their kitchen confession felt different, though the surface routine remained unchanged. Caleb still worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, still slept in the foreman's cabin, still maintained the pretense of proper distance. But now when he came in for meals, he sat closer. When they worked side by side cleaning up after dinner, their hands brushed more often and lingered. When they talked in the evenings before he reluctantly retreated to the cabin, the conversations went deeper, touching on dreams and fears they'd both kept locked away. Claire told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her mother's illness and her father's slow descent into grief madness after losing his wife. About the aunt who'd taken her in out of duty rather than love, who'd seen Clara as a commodity to be married off to the highest bidder. About the man, a banker named Harold Thornton, twice her age and cruel in small ways that others dismissed as eccentricity, who'd decided Clara would make a suitable wife whether she agreed or not. "He cornered me in my aunt's parlor one afternoon," Clara said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. They sat on the porch in the evening warmth, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. "Told me he'd already spoken to my aunt, already arranged everything. The wedding would be in October. He expected me to be grateful for his interest." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What did you do?" "I told him I'd rather die a spinster. He laughed, actually laughed, and said I'd come around once I realized I had no other options." Clara's voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the old anger underneath. "That night, I started planning my escape. Found the matrimonial agency in a newspaper, wrote to them, and when your letter came back through them, I saw my chance." "So you really were running?" "Yes, and I'm not sorry for it." Clara looked at him directly. "I'd run 1,000 miles before I'd let someone like Harold Thornton decide my future." Caleb understood that kind of determination. It was the same steel that had kept him going after Margaret and Samuel died, the same refusal to let circumstances break him completely. Clara had it too, just applied differently, running toward possibility instead of hiding from pain. "Tell me about them," Clara said softly. "Your wife and son, if you want to." Caleb was silent for a long moment, staring out at the land that stretched away in every direction. He'd avoided talking about Margaret and Samuel for 3 years, had shut down every well-meaning attempt by neighbors to draw him out. But here, now, with Clara waiting patiently beside him, he found the words coming easier than expected. Margaret was a teacher's daughter from Laramie. I met her at a barn dance when I was 25, just getting this ranch started. She had red hair and opinions about everything, and she made me laugh in a way nobody else ever had. The memory brought a sad smile. We got married 3 months later. Everyone said we were rushing, but we didn't care. We just knew. And Samuel? Born 2 years after we married, came early, small but healthy. He had his mother's hair and my stubbornness. Caleb's voice roughened. He was just starting to walk when the fever hit. Margaret got sick first, then Samuel. Doc Pemberton tried everything, but frontier medicine only goes so far. They died within hours of each other. Clara's hand found his, squeezed gently. I'm so sorry. The worst part wasn't the dying, it was after. Waking up in a house that was suddenly too quiet. Eating meals alone. Working this land they'd helped me build, and knowing they'd never see what it became. Caleb looked down at their joined hands. I stopped living, just existed, went through the motions because I didn't know what else to do. Until you wrote to the agency. Until I wrote to the agency and got drunk and desperate enough to reach for something, anything, that might make me feel human again. He turned to face her fully. I didn't expect you, Clara. Didn't expect someone who'd see right through my bullshit and refuse to leave. Didn't expect to care again. Do you regret it? Caring? Every day. At her stricken look, he quickly added, not because of you, because it's terrifying, because I know what it costs to lose someone you love, and the thought of going through that again. He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against his. I can't promise you won't lose me someday. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere by choice. I'm here, Caleb, as long as you'll have me. They sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars emerged. Caleb knew he should go to the cabin, should maintain the boundaries they'd set. But he stayed right where he was, Clara warm and solid beside him, and let himself imagine a future where she was always here, always waiting when he came home. The cattle drive had been scheduled for late July, a yearly necessity to move the herd to market before winter. Caleb had been dreading it, weeks away from the ranch, sleeping rough, dealing with the 100 things that could go wrong when you move 200 head of cattle across open territory. But now, with Clara woven into his daily life, the prospect of leaving felt almost unbearable. 2 weeks before the drive, Clara came to him with something wrapped in brown paper. What's this? He asked, accepting the package. Open it. He unwrapped it carefully and found a scarf, hand-knitted in dark blue wool, long enough to wrap twice around his neck. The work was meticulous, every stitch even and tight. Clara, this is practical. It gets cold at night on the trail, and you don't have anything warm enough. But her voice was soft, and Caleb knew it was more than practical. It was a talisman, a reminder, a physical connection to carry with him. Thank you. The words felt inadequate for what he was feeling. I'll think of you every time I wear it. That's the idea. The morning of the drive arrived with cloudless skies and unseasonable heat. Caleb loaded his gear onto his horse, checked and rechecked his supplies, and tried not to think about how much he didn't want to leave. Jack was already in the saddle, along with 3 hired hands they'd brought on specifically for the drive. The cattle were gathered and ready, milling restlessly in the holding pen. Clara stood on the porch watching the preparations, her arms crossed, and her expression carefully neutral. But Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes tracked his every movement. He crossed to her one last time, climbing the steps so they were at eye level. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4 if we run into weather. Jack knows what to do if anything comes up here. I know. We'll be fine. Clara's voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her apron. You be careful out there. I will. Caleb reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small Derringer pistol. I want you to keep this, in addition to the rifle. Clara took it, examined it professionally. I know how to use one of these. Good. Anyone gives you trouble? I'll shoot first and apologize later. You've told me. She met his eyes. Stop worrying about me and worry about yourself. Cattle drives are dangerous. Yes, ma'am. They stood looking at each other, and Caleb was acutely aware of Jack and the hired hands watching from the yard. He should just say goodbye and go. Should keep things professional. Should not be thinking about kissing Clara properly for the first time right here on the porch in front of everyone. Clara seemed to sense his thoughts because a small smile crossed her face. Go on. Your cattle are waiting. Clara, I'll be here when you get back. That's a promise. It had to be enough. Caleb forced himself to turn away, to mount his horse, to signal Jack to start moving the herd. As they rode out, he looked back once and saw Clara still standing on the porch, one hand raised in farewell. He touched the scarf she'd made him, tucked safely in his saddlebag, and thought about 3 weeks suddenly feeling like 3 years. The drive was brutal from the start. The heat didn't break. The cattle were ornery, and every water source they counted on was lower than expected due to the dry summer. They pushed the herd hard during the cooler morning hours, rested through the worst heat of midday, then drove again until dark. It was exhausting, dusty, mind-numbing work that required constant vigilance. But it gave Caleb too much time to think. During the long days in the saddle, watching the herd's undulating movement across the grassland, his mind kept circling back to Clara. The way she'd looked standing on that porch, the scarf she'd made him, the promise she'd given. By the second week, he was wearing the scarf every night despite the heat, wrapping it around his neck like a physical connection across the distance. Jack noticed, of course. Jack noticed everything. "That's nice workmanship," he commented one evening as they sat by the fire, the hired hands already asleep and the night sounds of the herd settling around them. Caleb touched the scarf self-consciously. "Clara made it." "Figured. She's got skilled hands." Jack poured coffee from the pot they kept near the coals. "You planning to keep her past the 3 months?" "We never really talked about it in those terms anymore." "That's not an answer." Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. "I want to marry her, Jack, properly, not because of some arrangement or agency letter, but because she's brought me back to life. I didn't think that was possible. So tell her that when we get back." "What if she says no? What if she wants her independence, her freedom? She ran from one man trying to control her future. Maybe she doesn't want another man deciding it." Jack snorted. "That woman chose to stay when you tried to send her away. Chose to make you a scarf and wait on your porch looking worried. I don't think she's running from you, Caleb. I think she's running toward you. But you'll never know unless you ask." "When did you become an expert on romance?" "I'm not. I'm just an expert on regret." Jack's voice went rough. "I never told my wife half the things I felt. Always figured there'd be time later. Then she was gone, and later never came. Don't make my mistakes." They sat in silence after that, but Jack's words stayed with Caleb through the remaining days of the drive. When they finally reached the railroad depot and sold the herd for a good price, Caleb's first thought wasn't the money or the successful completion of the drive. It was getting home to Clara. They made the return journey in half the time it had taken to bring the cattle, pushing their horses hard but not recklessly. Even so, it took 5 days of riding before the ranch came into view on the horizon. Caleb urged his horse faster, his heart pounding with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. As they crested the final rise, he saw smoke from the chimney, laundry on the line, and Clara working in her garden behind the house. She must have heard the hoofbeats because she stood up, shading her eyes. When she recognized them, her hand dropped and she started walking toward the house. Not running, just walking with that calm, purposeful stride. But Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders, the barely controlled energy. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, handed the reins to Jack, and crossed the yard in long strides. Clara met him at the porch steps, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She was dusty from the garden, her hair escaping its braid, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She'd never looked more beautiful. "You came back," she said. "I promised I would." 3 weeks and 4 days. I counted. "So did I." Caleb reached up, wiped the dirt from her cheek with his thumb. "Every single one." Clara's breath caught. "Caleb," he kissed her. Right there in the yard with Jack and the hired hands watching, with the sun beating down and the dust still settling from their arrival. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her the way he'd been wanting to for weeks, pouring 3 years of loneliness and loss and the terrifying hope of new beginning into it. Clara made a small sound of surprise. Then her arms came around his neck and she kissed him back with equal intensity. She tasted like sunshine and determination, like home and possibility and everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Not here. Tonight. After dinner. Just wait for me, all right?" Clara pulled back enough to meet his eyes, and what he saw there made his heart stutter. "I'll wait." Jack cleared his throat pointedly from across the yard. I'm taking the boys into town for supplies and a drink. We'll be back tomorrow. It was an obvious excuse to give them privacy, and Caleb was grateful for it. Thanks, Jack. Don't thank me. Just don't waste this chance. After Jack and the hands rode off, Caleb took care of his horse and cleaned up while Clara finished in the garden and started preparing dinner. The domesticity of it felt surreal after weeks of sleeping rough and eating trail food. He kept catching glimpses of her through the kitchen window, kept having to remind himself this was real, she was real, and tonight he was going to ask her the most important question of his life. Dinner was roasted chicken with vegetables from her garden, and Caleb barely tasted it despite knowing it was good. His mind was too busy rehearsing what he wanted to say, how he wanted to say it, whether she'd accept or whether he was about to make the biggest fool of himself in Wyoming territory. Clara seemed to sense his distraction because she kept the conversation light, asked about the drive, the sale, whether they'd had any trouble on the trail. Caleb answered automatically, his attention more on her than his own words, the way lamplight caught in her hair, the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth, the patient kindness in her eyes that saw right through his nervousness. After dinner, they cleaned up together in silence that felt charged with anticipation. When the last dish was dried and put away, Clara turned to him. All right, you've been thinking so hard all evening I can practically hear it. What did you want to ask me? Caleb took a deep breath, then reached for her hands. Let's go outside. I want to do this right. They walked out to the porch, and Caleb led her to the railing where they could see the sun setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, the same sky that had witnessed his proposal to Margaret 15 years ago, the same sky that had watched him bury his family and lock himself away in grief. Now it would witness him choosing to live again. When you stepped off that train 2 months ago, Caleb began, still holding her hands, I thought I was making a mistake that needed fixing. I had money in my pocket and a plan to send you away, but you wouldn't go. You looked me in the eye and refused to be dismissed. Clara's eyes glistened. I remember. You've spent these weeks transforming everything, the house, the garden, the way I think about tomorrow. You've made me taste my food again, made me want to come home instead of just existing. Made me believe that maybe I could have more than just survival. He swallowed hard. While I was gone, I wore your scarf every night. Jack teased me about it, but I didn't care. It was the only piece of you I had out there, and it reminded me that someone was waiting, that someone gave a damn whether I made it back. I did. I do. Clara's voice was thick with emotion. I know our arrangement was supposed to be temporary. 3 months, we said. But I don't want temporary anymore, Clara. I don't want you as my housekeeper or my employee. I want you as my wife. Not because some agency matched us on paper, but because you're the bravest, smartest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. And I love you. Clara's breath caught on a sob. Caleb, I'm not saying it'll be easy. I'm still healing from what I lost. You're still finding your way after what you escaped. But I want to do it together. Want to build something real with you. Want to wake up every morning knowing you're here, not because you have to be, but because you choose to be. He squeezed her hands gently. So I'm asking, Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? For real this time? Tears streamed down Clara's face, catching the last light of the sunset. Yes. Yes, of course, yes. Caleb pulled her into his arms, held her tight while she cried against his chest. Relief and joy and bone-deep gratitude washed through him. She'd said yes. This remarkable woman had chosen him, chosen this life, chosen to stay when she could have gone anywhere. I love you too, Clara said when she could finally speak. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was too fast, too complicated. But I fell in love with you anyway, with your quiet strength and your kindness and the way you look at me like I matter. You do matter, more than anything. They stood wrapped together on the porch as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged, and Caleb felt the last pieces of his broken heart shift into new alignment. Not the same as before. It would never be the same, but whole in a different way. Whole enough to love again. Whole enough to risk again. Whole enough to choose hope over fear. Clara pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. I should probably tell you something about why I was really so scared when you left for the cattle drive. What is it? That last night before you left, after you gave me the Derringer, I had a visitor. Her voice tightened. Harold Thornton, the man I ran from. He found me. Caleb's blood went cold. What? He came to the ranch while you were loading supplies, told me he'd tracked me across half the country, that my aunt had told him where I'd gone. He said the engagement stood, and I could either come back to Philadelphia willingly, or he'd take legal action to force me back. Clara's hands trembled slightly. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He got angry, grabbed my arm. I pulled the Derringer and told him to leave. He did, but he said he'd be back. Rage flooded through Caleb, hot and protective. Why didn't you tell me before I left? Because you had a job to do, and I didn't want you distracted or worried. I handled it. Clara, I know I should have told you, but I'm telling you now. She met his eyes steadily. He'll come back, Caleb. Men like Harold don't give up easily. And when he does, we need to be ready. Caleb pulled her close again, his mind already working through possibilities. Harold Thornton thought he could intimidate Clara, thought he had some claim on her future. He was about to learn how wrong he was. When he comes back, Caleb said quietly, he'll find you're not alone anymore. You're not some unprotected woman he can push around. You're mine now, and I protect what's mine. Clara looked up at him, and in the starlight he could see the fierce determination in her eyes. We protect each other. That's what partners do. Partners, Caleb agreed, and soon husband and wife. They went inside together, and for the first time since Clara arrived, Caleb didn't retreat to the cabin. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and making plans. For the wedding, for dealing with Harold Thornton, for the future they were going to build together. The conversation stretched late into the night, comfortable and real, and full of the kind of honest partnership Caleb had never thought he'd have again. When Clara finally stood to go upstairs, exhaustion pulling at her, Caleb caught her hand. I know we said we'd wait until the wedding, he said carefully. And we will. But would you mind if I stayed down here tonight? On the sofa, I don't want to be in the cabin. Not tonight. Clara smiled, tired but radiant. Stay. I'd like knowing you're close. She went upstairs, and Caleb stretched out on the sofa with a blanket, staring at the ceiling and marveling at how fast life could change. 2 months ago, he'd been a ghost in his own house. Tonight, he was engaged to a woman who'd refused to give up on him, planning a future he actually wanted to see. Upstairs, he could hear Clara moving around, getting ready for bed. The house creaked and settled around him, familiar and welcoming in a way it hadn't been in years. Caleb closed his eyes, one hand touching the scarf Clara had made him, and thought about tomorrow, about wedding plans and potential threats and all the normal complications of building a life with someone. He couldn't wait. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the kitchen windows, and Caleb woke on the sofa to the smell of coffee and the sound of Clara moving around upstairs. For a moment, he lay still, letting the reality settle over him. He was engaged to Clara, the woman who'd stepped off a train 2 months ago and changed everything. He sat up, folded the blanket, bent up the blanket, and was pulling on his boots when Clara descended the stairs. She'd braided her hair and wore a simple dress in pale yellow that made her look like captured sunlight. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest tighten. Good morning, she said, and there was shyness in her voice that hadn't been there before. The shyness of new beginnings, of changed circumstances. Morning. Caleb stood, crossed to her, and kissed her forehead the way he had before leaving for the cattle drive. But this time he didn't stop there. He kissed her properly, sweetly, a good morning kiss between two people who'd chosen each other. Sleep well? Better than I have in weeks. You? Same. They moved into the easy rhythm of morning, Clara making breakfast while Caleb started the fire and set the table. Through the window, he could see Jack and the hired hands returning from town, probably having stayed at the hotel overnight to give Caleb and Clara privacy. Jack would know what had happened just by looking at them. The man missed nothing. Sure enough, when Jack walked in 20 minutes later to discuss the day's work, he took one look at Caleb and Clara standing close by the stove and smiled. So, Jack said, should I be congratulating you two? We're getting married, Clara said simply, her hand finding Caleb's. Properly this time. About damn time. Jack's weathered face creased with genuine pleasure. "When's the wedding?" Caleb looked at Clara. They hadn't discussed specifics yet. "Soon," he said. "No reason to wait, is there?" "None at all," Clara agreed, "though I should probably mention that Harold Thornton's situation to Jack. He should know what we might be dealing with." While Clara explained about her unwanted suitor's visit, Caleb watched Jack's expression darken. When she finished, Jack was quiet for a long moment. "This Thornton," Jack said carefully, "he threatened you? Physically grabbed you?" "Yes, but I handled it." "And you think he'll come back?" "I know he will. Men like Harold don't accept no for an answer." Jack looked at Caleb. "We should tell the sheriff. Get it on record." "Already planning to ride into town today," Caleb said. "Want to talk to Reverend Walsh about the wedding anyway. Might as well handle both." They left after breakfast, Caleb and Clara taking the wagon into town while Jack stayed behind to manage the ranch. The ride gave them time to talk about practical matters: wedding arrangements, guest lists, what to do about Harold Thornton if he returned before they were legally married. "I was thinking," Claire said as the town came into view, "we could get married this weekend. Simple ceremony, just friends and neighbors. No need for anything elaborate." "You sure? Most women want—" "I'm not most women. I want to be your wife, Caleb. Everything else is just details." She glanced at him. "Unless you want something bigger?" "I want you. However that happens is fine with me." They found Sheriff Collins at his office, and Caleb explained the situation with Harold Thornton while Clara provided additional details: the man's full name, his business in Philadelphia, the nature of his threats. Collins took careful notes, his expression grave. "Legally, it's complicated," Collins admitted. "If he's claiming a prior engagement arrangement with her aunt's blessing, he might try to argue he has some kind of claim. But that's back east law, not Wyoming territory law. Out here, a woman's word about who she wants to marry carries weight." "What if he tries to take her by force?" Caleb asked. "Then it's kidnapping, and I'll arrest him." Collins looked at Clara. "You got witnesses to his threats?" "Just me. He was careful to approach when I was alone." "That's his word against yours then, but if he shows up again, you call for the sheriff immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." They left the sheriff's office and headed to the church, where Reverend Walsh greeted them warmly. The Reverend was in his 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had made him beloved in the community. "Caleb Rourke, as I live and breathe," Walsh said, shaking Caleb's hand. "And this must be the young lady I've heard so much about. Clara, is it?" "Yes, sir. Clara Whitmore." "Martha Henderson tells me you've brought some life back to the Rourke Ranch. High praise from Martha." Clara smiled. "I'm just doing my job." "She's being modest," Caleb said. "Reverend, we're here to ask if you'd marry us. This Saturday, if possible." Walsh's eyebrows rose. "This Saturday? That's only 4 days away." "We know it's short notice, but there's no reason to wait, and we'd like to make things official." Walsh studied them both carefully, and Caleb could see the Reverend taking in Clara's calm strength, the way she and Caleb stood close together, the obvious affection between them. Finally, Walsh smiled. "I've been hoping to see you return to the living, Caleb. If this young lady is the reason, then I'm happy to perform the ceremony." He pulled out a ledger. "Saturday afternoon work for you? Say, 3 o'clock? "Perfect," Claire said. They spent the next hour making arrangements. Walsh would handle the ceremony. Martha Henderson volunteered to organize a reception at her house. And word spread through town with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the time Caleb and Clara left to head home, half the county knew they were getting married on Saturday. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Clara cleaned the house until it gleamed, made arrangements for her dress with the town seamstress, and coordinated with Martha on the reception details. Caleb worked the ranch with Jack, but found his mind constantly wandering to Clara, to the wedding, to the life they were building together. Friday evening, Clara shooed him out of the house. "It's bad luck to see the bride the night before the wedding," she said, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "That's superstition." "Maybe, but humor me anyway. Go stay with Jack tonight. I'll see you at the church tomorrow." Caleb went reluctantly, spending the evening in Jack's cabin playing cards, and trying not to think about the fact that tomorrow his whole life would change again. Jack seemed to sense his nervousness because he kept the conversation light, told stories about his own wedding years ago, and generally served as the steadying presence Caleb needed. "You scared?" Jack asked as they were turning in for the night. "Terrified." "Good. Means you know what you're risking. But Caleb?" Jack's voice was serious. "She's worth it. Don't let fear make you hold back. Give her everything, your whole heart, messy as it is. That's what marriage is." Caleb lay awake long into the night thinking about Jack's words, about Margaret and Samuel, about the years he'd spent locked in grief. Tomorrow, he was choosing to unlock that prison, choosing to risk his heart again, choosing Clara. Saturday dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of late summer day that felt like a gift. Caleb dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since, and tried not to think about the symbolism. This wasn't ending something. It was beginning something new. He arrived at the church early, Jack beside him, and found the small building already filling with neighbors and friends. The Taylor family was there, Mr. Taylor still moving carefully, but recovered enough to attend. Martha Henderson bustled around organizing flowers. Sheriff Collins stood near the back, keeping an eye on things with professional vigilance. Then the door opened, and Clara walked in. She wore a simple dress in cream-colored silk that the seamstress had worked miracles to complete in 3 days. Her hair was pinned up with small wild flowers woven through it. She carried no bouquet, needed no adornment. She was beautiful in her simplicity, and when her eyes found his across the church, Caleb felt his breath catch. Clara walked down the aisle alone, no one to give her away because she belonged to herself first, and took her place beside him at the altar. Reverend Walsh smiled at them both, opened his Bible, and began the ceremony. The words washed over Caleb in a blur. He was too focused on Clara's hand in his, on the way she looked at him like he hung the moon, on the incredible reality that this woman had chosen him despite everything. When Walsh asked if he took Clara to be his wife, Caleb's voice was steady and sure. "I do." And when Clara was asked the same question, her "I do" rang clear through the church. They exchanged simple gold bands that Caleb had bought in town, nothing fancy, just solid circles of metal that would last. Then Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed Clara as his wife for the first time. The church erupted in applause, and they turned to face their neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Rourke. Caleb saw Jack beaming in the front row, saw Martha dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, saw the genuine happiness on the faces of people who'd watched him grieve for 3 years and were relieved to see him living again. The reception at Martha's house was simple, but joyful. There was food and music and dancing, and Caleb held Clara close as they swayed to a fiddle tune, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "Happier than I knew I could be," Clara said. "You?" "Same." They were interrupted by Sheriff Collins, who approached with an apologetic expression. "Hate to intrude on your celebration, but I thought you should know. I got a wire this morning. Harold Thornton left Philadelphia 3 days ago, heading west. Could be on his way here." Caleb felt Clara stiffen in his arms. He tightened his hold on her, protective and reassuring. "Thanks for the warning, Sheriff. I'll keep an eye out. If he shows up in town, I'll handle it." Collins nodded to them both. "Congratulations, by the way. You two are good together." After Collins left, Clara looked up at Caleb. "We should go home. If Harold's coming, I'd rather face him on our own ground." They said their goodbyes, accepted congratulations and well wishes, and headed back to the ranch as the sun was setting. The drive felt different now. They were man and wife, partners legally and spiritually, united against whatever challenges came. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon and swept her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of the house that was now truly theirs. Clara laughed, surprised and delighted, and Caleb kissed her in the doorway. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rourke," he said. "I like the sound of that." They moved inside, and the house that had been empty for so long now felt full in the best way. Caleb built a fire against the evening chill while Clara changed out of her wedding dress into something more practical. When she came back downstairs, she'd pinned up her hair and wore a simple dress that somehow made her look even more beautiful than the wedding gown. They sat together on the sofa, Clara tucked against Caleb's side, and talked about everything and nothing. About the future they wanted to build, children maybe, someday when they were ready. About expanding the ranch, About Clara's idea to start teaching local children who couldn't afford proper schooling, about growing old together on this land. They were so absorbed in their conversation that neither heard the horse approach until hoofbeats sounded right outside. Caleb was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver, moving to the window. A man dismounted in the yard, tall, well-dressed in Eastern fashion, with an arrogant bearing that immediately set Caleb's teeth on edge. Even without introduction, he knew this was Harold Thornton. "Stay inside," Caleb told Clara. "No." Clara stood, her face pale but determined. "We face this together. Remember?" Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to shield her from this confrontation, but he'd meant what he said about partnership. "Together, then. But stay behind me." They walked out onto the porch as Harold Thornton tied his horse and turned to face them. He was handsome in a cold way, with calculating eyes that swept over Clara with possessive familiarity before dismissing Caleb entirely. "Clara," Thornton said, his voice cultured and condescending, "I've come to take you home. This nonsense has gone on long enough." "I am home," Clara said steadily, "and I'm not going anywhere with you, Harold." "Don't be dramatic. Your aunt explained everything. You were confused, frightened by the prospect of marriage. But I'm willing to overlook your flight if you come back now." "I wasn't confused. I was escaping. There's a difference." Thornton's expression hardened. "Clara, be reasonable. You can't seriously intend to stay out here in this wilderness, living like some frontier woman. You're educated, cultured. You belong in Philadelphia society, not—" He gestured dismissively at the ranch. "This." Caleb stepped forward, putting himself slightly in front of Clara. "The lady's made her choice clear. Time for you to leave." Thornton finally looked at him directly, and there was contempt in his gaze. "And who are you? The rancher she's been keeping house for? Do you really think you can give her what she needs, what she deserves?" "I'm her husband," Caleb said quietly. "As of about 3 hours ago. So yes, I think I can give her what she needs. Respect, partnership, and a life she chose for herself." The color drained from Thornton's face. "Her husband? That's impossible. She's engaged to me. Her aunt—" "Had no authority to engage me to anyone," Clara cut in. "I'm 24 years old, Harold, a grown woman capable of making my own decisions, and I've decided to marry Caleb Rourke. It's done. Legal and binding." Thornton's mask of civility cracked, revealing the anger underneath. "You stupid, foolish girl. Do you have any idea what you've thrown away? My position, my wealth, everything I could have given you." "You could have given me a prison," Clara said. "A gilded cage where I'd slowly suffocate under your control. I chose freedom instead. I chose love. I chose Caleb. This isn't over." Thornton's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I have lawyers. I have influence. I'll have this sham marriage annulled." "No, you won't." Sheriff Collins stepped out from the shadow of the barn, where he'd apparently been waiting. "Because there's nothing illegal or improper about two consenting adults getting married in Wyoming territory. You, on the other hand, have made threats against Mrs. Rourke. I've got her sworn statement and witnesses. If you don't leave peacefully right now, I'll arrest you for harassment and intimidation." Thornton spun to face Collins, clearly not having expected law enforcement. "This is outrageous. I have rights." "Not in my county, you don't. You've got two choices, Mr. Thornton. Ride out of here peacefully and head back east, or spend the night in my jail before I put you on tomorrow's train personally. Your choice." For a long moment, Thornton stood rigid with fury, his hands clenched into fists. Caleb's hand stayed on his revolver, ready for anything. But finally, Thornton's survival instincts won out over his pride. "This isn't finished," he said, looking at Clara with cold hatred. "You'll regret this choice, Clara. Mark my words." "The only thing I regret," Clara said, her voice steady as steel, "is ever being polite to you in the first place. Goodbye, Harold. Don't come back." Thornton mounted his horse with sharp, angry movements and rode off into the darkness. Collins watched him go, then turned to Caleb and Clara. "I'll follow him to town. Make sure he gets on that train tomorrow morning." Collins tipped his hat. "Congratulations again on the wedding. And Mrs. Rourke? You handled that beautifully." After Collins left, Caleb and Clara stood on the porch in silence, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Finally, Clara let out a shaky breath. It's really over, she said. He's gone. You were incredible, Caleb said, pulling her into his arms. The way you faced him down, refused to be intimidated. I'm in awe of you. I was terrified. Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway. Kissed the top of her head. You're the bravest person I know, Clara Rourke. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Say it again. Clara Rourke. I'm never going to get tired of hearing that. She smiled, and the fear was gone, replaced by joy. Can we go inside now? I'd like to start our wedding night properly. Caleb swept her into his arms again, carried her inside, and kicked the door shut behind them. The house was warm and welcoming, the fire crackling in the hearth, and for the first time in 3 years, it felt like a home instead of a mausoleum. They stayed up late talking, sitting close on the sofa, making plans and sharing dreams. When they finally went upstairs together, Caleb paused at the threshold of the main bedroom, the room he'd avoided for so long, the room where Margaret had died. Clara seemed to sense his hesitation. We can use a different room if you'd rather. No, Caleb took a deep breath. This is our room now, our future. The past doesn't get to hold us hostage anymore. They crossed the threshold together, and Caleb found that the ghost he'd been avoiding had finally loosened their grip. The room was just a room. The bed was just a bed. And the woman beside him was his wife, his partner, his future. The months that followed their wedding brought a rhythm to life that Caleb had never quite experienced before. With Clara as his wife rather than his housekeeper, the pretense of distance disappeared completely. They worked the ranch together, made decisions together, faced challenges as a united front. Clara's vegetable garden flourished and expanded, providing food for their table and surplus to sell in town. She started teaching 3 local children whose families couldn't afford the school fees, holding lessons in the ranch house twice a week. The ranch prospered under their partnership. Caleb found that Clara had a head for business. She organized their accounts, negotiated better prices for supplies, and suggested improvements that increased efficiency. Together, they built something stronger than either could have managed alone. Winter came hard that year, with early snows that buried the landscape in white silence. But the house was warm, well-stocked with food Clara had preserved from her garden, and filled with a contentment Caleb hadn't known was possible. On long winter evenings, they sat by the fire, Caleb reading while Clara knitted, or both of them just talking, sharing the comfortable silence of 2 people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. Jack continued to run the day-to-day ranch operations with his usual competence, but even he seemed lighter now that the ranch house was alive again. He joined them for dinner most nights, and the 3 of them became a kind of family, bound not by blood but by choice and mutual respect. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and new calves, and Clara announced she was pregnant. The news hit Caleb with a complexity of emotions he hadn't anticipated, joy and terror in equal measure. The thought of being a father again, of risking his heart on a child who might be taken like Samuel had been, nearly paralyzed him with fear. But Clara, patient and wise, helped him work through it. We can't live our lives afraid of loss, she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Yes, something could happen. Something could always happen. But choosing not to love, not to hope, not to build a family, that's just another kind of loss. A loss you inflict on yourself. She was right, of course. So Caleb chose hope over fear, chose to be present for this pregnancy instead of hiding in anxiety. He built a cradle from oak wood using skills he'd thought he'd forgotten. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, transforming one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery. Their daughter was born on a clear October morning, healthy and loud and perfect. They named her Rose after Margaret's mother, and as Caleb held his newborn daughter for the first time, he felt the final pieces of his shattered heart slide into place. Not the same configuration as before, the loss of Margaret and Samuel would always be part of him, but whole in a new way, healed enough to hold this new love without fear. Clara proved to be a natural mother, calm and confident even when Rose cried through the night or refused to eat. And Caleb discovered that second-time fatherhood was different from the first. He was older now, more aware of how precious and fragile this gift was. He held Rose carefully, marveled at her tiny fingers and fierce grip, and understood that love was always a risk worth taking. As Rose grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Caleb expanded the herd, bought additional land from a neighbor who was retiring, and built a larger barn. Clara's teaching had grown from 3 students to 8, and she was talking about maybe building a proper schoolhouse if they could get enough families interested. They faced hard times too, a drought one summer that had Caleb worried about the cattle, a winter so brutal they lost a dozen head to the cold, times when money was tight and decisions were difficult, but they faced everything together, and somehow that made even the hardest challenges manageable. On a warm summer evening 5 years after their wedding, Caleb stood on the porch watching Clara play with Rose in the yard. Their daughter was 3 now, running around with the fearless energy of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. Clara's laughter carried across the yard as Rose showed her mother a grasshopper she'd caught. Jack emerged from the barn, stopped beside Caleb, and followed his gaze. "You did good, Caleb." "We did good," Caleb corrected. "Couldn't have managed any of this without you. I'm not talking about the ranch, though that's thriving too." Jack smiled. "I'm talking about choosing to live again, choosing Clara, choosing hope. That took real courage." Caleb thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, hollow and bitter, going through the motions of existence without really living. Then he thought about the letter he'd written in a moment of whiskey-soaked desperation, about Clara stepping off that train and refusing to be sent away, about every choice that had led to this moment. "She saved me," Caleb said quietly. "I was drowning, and I didn't even know it. She threw me a lifeline." "You saved each other," Jack said. "That's what the best partnerships do." Clara looked up then, saw them watching, and waved. Rose waved too, her small hand mimicking her mother's gesture. Caleb waved back, his chest tight with a feeling that had taken him years to recognize as simple, uncomplicated happiness. That night, after Rose was asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Caleb and Clara sat together on the porch, as they had countless times before. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How different my life is now compared to 5 years ago. How grateful I am that you were stubborn enough to stay when I tried to send you away." Clara smiled. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too, writing to that agency, getting drunk enough to actually mail the letter." Caleb wrapped his arm around her. "I thought I was looking for someone to fill empty spaces. Turns out I was looking for you." "We found each other. That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, and Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. The grief he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared. Margaret and Samuel would always be part of his story. But it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet memory rather than a crippling wound. He could think about them now without feeling like he was drowning, could honor what they'd shared while still embracing what he had with Clara. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For everything. For being brave enough to start over. For refusing to settle for less than you deserved. For choosing me even though I was broken." Clara turned to face him, her eyes serious in the starlight. "You were never broken, Caleb, just hurt. There's a difference. Broken things can't heal. Hurt things can, with the right care and enough time." She touched his face gently. "We healed each other." Caleb kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 5 years of partnership and love and hard-won happiness. When they broke apart, Clara rested her head on his shoulder again, and they watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. Inside the house, Rose made a small sound in her sleep, and Clara smiled. "I should check on her. I'll come with you." They went inside together, climbed the stairs to the nursery, and stood watching their daughter sleep. Rose had Clara's blonde hair and Caleb's stubborn jaw, and she was the perfect combination of both of them. Tomorrow, they'd teach her to ride the gentle mare Caleb had bought specifically for that purpose. Next week, Clara would start planning the small school building they'd finally gotten enough support to build. Next month, they'd help Jack celebrate his 60th birthday. There would be challenges ahead. There always were. Droughts and storms, hard winters and difficult decisions. But they'd face everything together, the way they had from the beginning. Caleb thought about that first day at the train station, about Clara stepping down with her carpet bag and her refusal to be dismissed, about the 3 months he'd said they needed to decide if the arrangement would work. 3 months had turned into 5 years, and those years had been filled with more life, more joy, more genuine partnership than he'd ever imagined possible. "Come on," Claire whispered, taking his hand. "Let's go to bed." They returned to their room, the room that had once been a place of grief, but was now just their room, filled with their life together. Caleb held Clara close as they drifted towards sleep, and his last thought before darkness claimed him was simple and true. He'd been given a second chance at life, at love, at happiness, and he wasn't going to waste a single moment of it. In the morning, he'd wake beside his wife, check on their daughter, work the land that had become truly theirs. He'd build and grow and love with the full knowledge that nothing was guaranteed, that loss was always possible, but that the risk was worth it. Because Clara had taught him the most important lesson of all, that surviving wasn't the same as living, that real courage meant choosing hope even when fear seemed safer, that love, in all its terrifying vulnerability, was always worth the price. And as Wyoming stars wheeled overhead and the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of deep night, Caleb Rourke finally, truly came home.